Okay, welcome. This is Professor TOVANCHE, and today we're going to be talking about Black life at the turn of the 20th century, as you can see. Okay, so with Reconstruction ending, Black people are struggling to define themselves. They're no longer a community of slaves, they're a community of free people. And they're sort of straddling two worlds. One is the world of slavery, from which they're emerging, where they were the ultimate other, right? Another is this world that they're trying to break into, and that is that of being, quote, an American. And that is being a citizen, being welcomed in a nation that does not fully really accept them. That's what they're hoping for. Discrimination in the country is the norm. It happens in the North and it happens in the South. In the South, it's typically more violent, although things can get nasty in the North as well. Because of all the discrimination and because of the lack of acceptance by the majority population, the Black community will largely turn inward. They will form their own sort of African American culture. They will work to create self-sufficient economies. They will migrate to places where there's greater opportunity for them. And all the while, they will be resisting their second-class designation. So we should recognize that Black resistance and this idea of a Black civil rights movement has deeper roots than most of us imagine. We've already seen that during the Civil War and Reconstruction, people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, they worked to integrate public transportations in various places, public transportation systems like streetcars. And as the 19th century is closing, this movement will expand, largely because the situation demands it. Reconstruction has been, quote, a failure. The federal government is not active in securing civil rights. State governments are, in fact, active in infringing civil rights and civil liberties. So Black people must do it largely themselves, with the help of well-meaning white allies, of which there are a good number. In fact, if you remember, we talked about Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was this Black man, right, 1/8, who was in fact supported by a community of white, well-meaning white folk in Louisiana who wanted to change things. So the movement is expanding, but it's coming in face to face with horror. The most horrific and pressing problem at the time, of course, is lynching. In the years leading up to the 20th century, more than 1,000 Black people are lynched, mostly in the South, not always, mostly men, not always. And of course, lynchings will continue well into the 20th century. And the numbers that we have are those of reported lynchings, only reported. So this is a smaller number than probably is the reality. But it also doesn't include in these numbers here Mexican Americans, which were a huge number of, accounted for a huge number of lynching victims in the Southwest and out in California. There were, of course, other lynching victims like Chinese and the occasional Italian. But lynching is a problem for people who are non-white. When we talk about lynching, we're talking about, and we'll define it a little bit more, but well, here, let's just do it now. Lynching is not necessarily a hanging, okay? And is not necessarily just, hanging a horse thief. I mean, they call that lynching. But lynching, the term as it is understood among historical circles and people in academic circles, they tend to define it as more than just a hanging, and usually involving mob violence and usually involving some sort of pretext for the killing, meaning, oh, this guy did something wrong and therefore we're going to kill him. Which, when in fact it was pretend, because what they really wanted to do in a lot of these instances was simply mete out punishment to people who they saw rising. So lynching is not necessarily hanging. It is usually public murder and mutilation. It can involve, other than hanging, it can involve dismembering of the body, burning somebody alive, and again, with barely a semblance of legality, where a mob comes together and they, under the pretense of meting out frontier justice, they kill people. Black women are a little safer. Not always. They get lynched as well. You've seen the pictures. Black women would stand up, though, and denounce all of this. As their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, their sons, they're all being subjected to torture and ritualized killing, because this is what it was. It was ritualized. They will stand up to protect the men in their lives, the men in their community. And the most famous of these women is a woman by the name of Ida B. Wells, who jumps into the fight after some of her friends are killed. In 1892, in Memphis, Tennessee, she had these black friends who were store owners at the time. They had competed with a white store in the area, and the white community didn't like this. So conflict escalated into violence. Dozens of black people are put in jail. And once they're put in jail, a white mob breaks in and lynches a bunch of them, shooting them, eye gouging, all kinds of nastiness. And as a journalist, Ida B. Wells will stand up to publicly criticize city officials. She says to the city officials, "You are shielding, protecting the perpetrators of these crimes." In fact, sometimes these people are members of law enforcement themselves. So she criticizes city officials, and she also points out that most lynchings by far are not really based, or they don't spring out of an accusation of a black man raping a white woman, although very often that is what's said. She says this is really about attacking black men of means, those men who are successful, people who vote, people who hold office, people who have good jobs, maybe own land or a business. And she says the rape stories are often used as cover just to enrage white folk. So she tracks the statistics of lynchings and their causes and sheds a lot of light on the problem. She's hoping that facts would change minds, that lynching is not really about punishing unruly black people, but to attack successful black people. And of course, she will become a celebrated among her own circle, really, and some white folks as well. She will become a celebrated writer, lecturer, activist. She will actually help found what it becomes known as the British Anti-Lynching Committee. In 1894, the British Anti-Lynching Committee is, of course, it's in the name, it's dedicated to ending lynching. Wells is one of many women who are dedicated to the well-being of black folk. She is, in fact, one of the most notable. Probably also because not only what she did, but what she was up against was so horrific. But she's one of many. And black women in the late 1800s will come together in the name of uplifting their race. We've talked about the uplift thing, right? They want better education, better homes, job training, sanitary conditions in the homes and in their neighborhoods. They push for a sense of self-worth, where they say these people need help, but the people need to help themselves. So in fact, they talk about self-help and they talk about Christianity. And all of this is sort of thrown under the rubric, the title of social reconstruction. And these women say, and a lot of these women who are engaged in this tend to be well off, or at least middle class. There was in a lot of these cities segments of the black population who in fact who were people of means. And these are the women who are in fact engaging the social issues. And they're talking about social reconstruction, particularly among the poor black folk who don't have a lot. They're talking about uplifting the race and reconstructing the social nature of the community. And again, the leaders of this, they're usually, middle class with wealth and education. And the idea, of course, is that women, the idea at the time was certainly strong. And even to some degree today, there's this idea that women are the moral centers of the home, that they are natural caregivers. And so they, in fact, they take it upon themselves to expand their concern, expand their social role of the home in caregiving, and extending it to the community. They see the community as an extension of their home, and their natural caregiving powers, I suppose, to put it kind of badly, right? Their natural powers as natural caregivers will actually position them for that. But they also position themselves as protectors of the virtue of Black women, because during slavery, they were sexualized. They were considered almost animalistic sexual beings. And so what these women want to do is change all of that with this idea of uplifting each other and reconstructing who they are. Of course, this is something that flies in the face of what people would say is social Darwinistic, right? These women are pushing against this idea of social Darwinism. You may remember social Darwinism was the idea that people belong where they are, that the only reason people rise up is if they don't really belong where they start. And that's a natural order of things, and that you shouldn't mess with nature in God's plan. Well, these women are saying, oh no, you can reconstruct society. One of the things that they're doing again is trying to reconstruct the image of Black women who have been hypersexualized under slavery, and in fact, arguably still are today. So these women, they set up the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. It starts with the National Association of Colored Women as a club, but then it kind of expands. You're going to see by 1896, and by the way, this is even before the NAACP, which we'll talk about shortly, where the women are coming together and doing this, and they're setting up clubs that will, in fact, be engaged in this idea of uplift and social reconstruction. People like Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells in the late 1800s, they actually found this organization, the National Association of Colored Women. Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells are founding members. And this association it pushes what becomes known as the politics of respectability. That there's this idea, becoming respectable, being respectable, is how we rise. If you want to be treated as a respectable individual, you must act respectably. But in a sense, it reminds me of what I've seen also as I was growing up. Growing up in the urban area of Cleveland, and even growing up as a Mexican guy, right? There's always a sense that you have to be better than anyone else. You can't, as a brown person, as a Black person, you cannot be lazy, because then all the stereotypes are heaped on top of you. You can't just be a guy who just decides, I don't feel like doing this, because people are gonna say, oh, look at him, right? That's because of his color, that's because of his ethnicity, whatever, and so in fact, a lot of people today, have the same kind of ideas of having to be better than others. I mean, when I was in law school, I was one of maybe two brown faces in a law school class of 90 people. And that was stressful for me, because I always recognized, I understood that there was a particular sort of expectation, usually low, of me. And so I was always working, it seemed, doubly hard, just to ensure that when I get called on, I'm not going to be the guy who doesn't know the answer, and for people to say, oh, what's he doing here? So I get this idea of the politics of respectability, but it is, of course, something that can be very onerous. It can be heavy on you when you have to be on, so to speak, all the time. But this politics of respectability gets ingrained in these middle-class Black people in the late 1800s, and even through today. My wife, she tells a story, and I'm going to get it wrong, and she's probably going to come in here and correct me. But she tells a story of how she met Black students, college students, years ago when she was living in Atlanta. And I think was it Howard? No, it wasn't Howard students. It was a Black school in the area, college. And she recognized that these were the most polite students, well-dressed, well-spoken young people she'd ever met. Because there's this idea of you have to be respectable. Now, today, a lot of people push back against that, because it is a burden to carry. There's a lot of people who say, no, I refuse to fit that dominant culture that wants to make me speak a certain way. Young people do this. I mean, they've always done this, right? And people of color do this, and they've been doing it forever. So this politics of respectability, I guess, can have, it can cut both ways. On the one hand, it can be, well, it will be something that gets you where you want to be, because if you act respectably, people are more likely to actually treat you that way. But it's not always so. And people say it's a very, very hard burden to carry. But these women are talking about uplifting yourself even as you climb. So they're talking about lifting as they climb, right? So as you climb, you will lift others behind you. And so they form organizations, they engage in their communities, they actually set up schools, and they set up scholarships and grants for Black students who had nearly no chance of getting them otherwise. There were scholarships back in the day, but there's no way that they're going to get them. These scholarships had to be only for Black students. They had to be specifically for Black students in order for a Black person to actually get a scholarship. Now, today, there's a lot of, I don't know, dissension, conflict, animosity. I don't know what word to use, but some people don't like the fact that scholarships that are privately funded, right? And that's what these were. They were private. That scholarships will often be, of course, targeting certain groups of people, like Black people, brown people, right? Poor people, whatever. But those are still there because look at this history. And again, they're private. So you can give your money to whoever you want to. So Black students would have nearly no chance of going to college or going to school if it weren't for well-meaning people coming and donating. And so this is one of the major attributes of what and characteristics and activities of these Black women organizations. Another thing that they form, and this is something that happens throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, in a time called the Progressive Age. Progressive meaning moving forward, right? During the Progressive Age, there were many settlement houses that sprout up. Now, just generally speaking, these were often run by white women, settlement houses. The first one was in Chicago, Hull House, right? Hull, Hull House, by a woman named Jane Addams, is established in like 1889, 90, right around there. And so this is the first one, but then it spreads to other areas of the North, urban areas in particular, and they're dedicated to helping lesser folks, immigrants, the urban poor. And again, these are run by women, middle class, usually white women with an education. But Black women have their own network of settlement houses as well. So, for example, here you have the Branch Settlement House in Chicago. You also have, in 1908, you're going to have the Phyllis Wheatley home be founded. And Phyllis Wheatley, by this time, is long dead, but this home is set up by a woman named Elizabeth Lindsay Davis, who's also a member of the National Association of Colored Women. Excuse me. And so these are examples of how women of some means are trying to uplift their community and trying to tell their communities, all members of the community, not only must you lift yourself, but you must uplift others. And by the way, just so you understand, these Black settlement houses, like the settlement houses run by white folk, they are about pushing education. They offer classes in reading and writing and so forth, classes in job training. They offer childcare. They offer temporary housing. Sometimes, remember, many Black people are migrating to cities after the South, after the war, and especially during and after Reconstruction. And so they're engaging, they give these services, they offer real help like childcare and temporary housing. They preach about sanitation in the home, like others. I mean, this is what settlement houses do at this time. The white settlement house is usually for immigrants. These women are doing it for Black people in their own community. They're pushing sanitation in the home. And this idea of germ theory, right? The idea that germs cause disease, that's something that in the late 1800s was not really accepted by most people, at least, because they weren't really educated on it. But middle class educated people understood there was such a thing as a germ. And so the more you clean, the better the more likely you will not to get sick. You will be not to get sick. Back in the day, a lot of people didn't really bathe. Even into the early 1900s, you might bathe once a week or so. People used to think that way back when they thought that a nice thin layer of dirt would like protect you. It was like a shield or something. Of course, they were wrong. So they push sanitation in the home. They also push for temperance, which, the word temperance basically means moderation, not too much, not too little. But the term temperance takes on a particular meaning at this time, and that is no drinking, because the women, of course, are going to be the ones that are engaged in this, largely because very often they're the ones who are, and probably even today, victims of alcoholic, men beating them. Usually, not always, but you get the point. And so back then, women are involved in this, and they want temperance. They want men to stop drinking. They say, it's immoral. It causes violence. The money that you spend could, in fact, be used to feed your family. I don't know about you all, but I grew up in places where I saw people whose friends who had parents who people are living very poor and maybe off the government here and there. The kids maybe didn't have a whole lot to eat that day, but the mom, she's got her cigarettes, right? So I've seen a lot of that in Cleveland. And it's interesting. I live sort of in mostly in a white neighborhood, although I kind of lived on the border, which I will talk about later on. And so I had some Black friends. I had a lot of white friends, and so I saw it all over. It wasn't a race thing; it was a class thing, right? So they push for temperance, no drinking, and so they offer all these services. And if it's something that they can't help you with, they actually very often act as a resource guide, meaning they will point you in the right direction. So they network with each other. They also try to network with government. Black women engage local government. They act as liaisons, somewhat as a go-between between their community and local officials. They lobby local officials, meaning they go to them and they try to get them to change things. They want public funds for their community. They want money donated from the government to help their community. They want government officials, and these are all white men, they want them to give them not just money for the community, but they want to pass laws on temperance. And by the way, white women are involved in this, a lot. And so they're trying to get government to do something for the people, because at this time, government doesn't really do much for the people at all, by the way. At this time, there's no federal government helping at all. There's no, workman's compensation. There's no food stamps. There's none of that kind of stuff. At the local level, you had some help here and there. But what these women find is that because they were, quote, the wrong color, they're usually not going to be given anything. But they're trying. Another thing that they push for is what's called municipal housekeeping, because cities are nasty and dirty. I mean, this is, of course, a bunch of white kids here, but this is, I couldn't find a good picture of sort of a Black community, but this is, if this is the white community and there's a dead horse there, what does a Black community look like? Of course, these are young immigrant children, probably. This is New York City, by the way. And so these kinds of things were not unheard of. So this is a picture, in fact, that was taken for the benefit of white settlement workers who are going around trying to document all the ills and dangers and nastiness of society. But Black women are also engaged in this idea of municipal housekeeping, cleaning up the city, cleaning up their area of the town. Black women are usually not very successful, though. As I said, they're not given much money. White women, progressives, they're given money, but because of prejudice, they're not given anything. And also because, if think of it this way, if you are a white male official, mayor of the city or council member, and you have white women coming to you asking for support, asking for money, asking for this or asking for that, that their husbands vote regularly, probably, or at least they can. Meanwhile, black women in the South, for sure, and even sometimes in the North, don't have husbands who can vote because of some of the rules, or at least some of the pressures. So these white officials who see black women coming to them, they're thinking, well, first of all, you're black. There's prejudice there, but also your husband, you probably can't really vote anyway. So why should I even talk to you? And so they have little political clout, these women. And so you see very little change. You see a lot of white women making change, though that comes slowly. So that means that black settlement houses, as they were called, black settlement houses, they have to be privately funded. Black hospitals, privately funded. Parks and playgrounds, privately funded. And this is a time when, as you can see, streets are dirty and dangerous, where women of all colors wanted kids to be actually safer off the streets, in parks and in playgrounds. And while white women are getting playgrounds put in place for white kids, remember the segregation even in the North, black women are having trouble doing that because they must rely on private donations. But black women progressives, they inspire and take inspiration from other black leaders. In fact, toward the end of the 19th century, that is the late 1800s, there are several major leaders who rise. One of them, of course, is a guy named Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington founds the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It's a college for black students. And at first, it places a strong emphasis on vocational training, which means working with your hands, right? Your woodworking, your metalworking, later on electrical stuff, right? Basically, what they call it is an industrial education, where in this booming industrial revolution, which we'll talk about shortly, at the time in the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. You need an you need to learn how to work with your hands in order to succeed and make money. So they push industrial education. In fact, the first class of bricklayers at this college actually builds the college. They're building the college as they're studying, learning bricklaying. And this college at Tuskegee, it's a major success, and it graduates thousands of black men mostly for a long time. And it gets a lot of funding from rich white folk. People like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller. This guy, Booker T. and the Tuskegee Institute, they get a lot of support from the white population generally. Well, why? Well, it's because, well, for a few reasons. First of all, he starts out, Booker T, very humbly. This guy is the epitome of success, the embodiment of success that people like to point to. This guy was born a slave in the 1850s. He had a white father, by the way, a white father, and of course, a slave mother. What's interesting is that he's half and half, but we still call him black, kind of like Obama. So we have to wonder how far we've come from the idea of one drop. Of course, it's more complicated than that. Black people certainly like to claim Booker T. Washington. Black people certainly like to claim Obama, and I get it. But what makes him black instead of white? I mean, he's half, right? But we call him black. And again, I think it has to do with the history of the bloodlines, the one drop rule that we talked about. It's sort of ingrained in our culture to think of somebody this way. Anyway, this guy is born a slave, and after the war, and he's still a child, or at least pretty young anyway. And he works in the salt mines of West Virginia, and this is hard work. And he goes to work in the salt mines, and he goes to school in the evening, and he's always driven to succeed and to get educated. Later on, he enrolls in college. He goes to, it's called the Hampton Institute, but whatever. He enrolls in college, and as he's there, he works as a janitor at the very college just to pay his room and board. And of course, people take notice. Eventually he becomes a teacher at that same school. And then, of course, other people notice. He catches the eye of the school president at Hampton, who was a white man. And the president wants him to open a school for black men in the South. This is before he opens Tuskegee, right? Now, this is pay attention. I mean, there are some white people who, in fact, are progressive in their approach to the uplift of race, uplift of black people. Is not to say that they would have, wanted, people like Booker T dating their sisters, but they also understood the need for the community to rise. It would help everyone. So this president of Hampton reaches out to Booker T and says, I want to open a school for black men in the South. And so Booker T is a founding member of the Tuskegee Institute, where they push vocational training, personal responsibility, moral character, strong ambition, a strong work ethic, the usual kinds of things that people point to when they say, oh, this is a good man, right? Or this is a good woman. This person is respectable, moral, ambitious, ethical. And he writes all of this stuff up in his memoir in 1901 called Up From Slavery. And so for this reason and other reasons, he's embraced by many rich white folk. They like what he represents. They like his message. And Washington's message, of course, generally is personal achievement. Collective achievement can come from personal achievement. He says, do for yourself as an individual, and you will rise. And if you do it, and your brother does it, and your cousin does it, and the person down the road does it, then you will all rise. So he's got this idea of individual achievement leading to collective achievement. And this, of course, is very impressive to white people. But and by the way, I mean, this is actually, I've seen it in Fort Worth here. This is called the Booker T ladder, and it looks like it goes off into the sky, but it doesn't, right? Because it's an optical illusion. It's actually very, very, very tapered at the end there, and it just looks like it's far away. But it's a pretty interesting piece of art as art goes. And so it, of course, suggests that there is a ladder. All you have to do is climb it. Nobody's going to pull you up. And so a lot of people like this. But he can also sometimes come across as what people call accommodationist. Now, he's talking about self-sufficiency. He's talking about the commonalities between white people and black people. He doesn't want to talk about the differences so much. He embraces nationalism, rah, rah, rah. And he also accepts the status quo, and he teaches others to accept the status quo. What is the status quo? What is the normal way of doing things here? Jim Crow. So he's called an accommodationist because this guy is not about rocking the boat. This guy is not about challenging the status quo. He's about accepting segregation. And a lot of this is exhibited in a speech he gives in 1895 in Atlanta, where he's giving a speech to really a group of almost all white folk. And the message is that economic freedom for black people is the way to go. Meaning, don't worry about the social stuff. Just get a good job, work with your hands, you will rise, others will rise. It's slow, but it's sure. He also says in this speech, black people, forget about the past. Don't dwell on it. Accept your place at the bottom. Be loyal. Be patient. He has this famous line where he says, cast down your bucket where you are. That can be a little confusing, but what it means, cast down your bucket where you are. He's saying, wherever you happen to be, get to work and you will rise. And of course, he says to these people, black folk must not fight for equality. They must not fight for integration. He said this is what he calls, quote, a folly. It's ridiculous. It's foolish. It won't work. Now, his speech is loved by many ordinary black people because, they need hope. They want this idea. They like this idea of individual uplift. But of course, countless white folk like this because, hey, this guy isn't really about fighting their position. He's about rising, but not upsetting us. For this reason, for all these reasons, this speech will be dubbed the Atlanta Compromise, because he talks about, hey, just do it for yourself. Don't worry about integration. But a lot of black people are like, no, this is a compromise that we cannot actually adhere to. We cannot accept. A lot of people want to fight. What's interesting is, though, that Washington gets a bad rap. Washington may not be the race traitor that some make him out to be. When I talk about this in class, I will throw the question out to the class. Was he? What do you think about him? Some people say he was a traitor to his race. Others say no. But so we have to consider, what does it mean for these people to rise? Is his advice practical? What would be the consequence of resisting in this world? I mean, we've seen the lynching pics. How easy would it be for you in the South, right? Because, by the way, the Tuskegee Institute is in Alabama. What would be the consequences of resisting? He lives in the South, as do the men that he wishes to help. So maybe we back off of him just a little bit, right? Because we have to look at the circumstances in which he operated, in which he lived. We also can point to his private thoughts, which he didn't really talk about publicly. His private thoughts actually seem to have differed from what he said publicly. In private, he uses a lot of his money to try to influence new laws, to try to get legislation passed that would change Jim Crow, that would end Jim Crow. So he's working behind the scenes. He also hires lawyers to file lawsuits under the existing civil rights laws, like the Reconstruction Amendments, the statutes, and so forth. He hires lawyers secretly to file suits. So he's funding these suits. And in the meantime, he's publicly saying, hey guys, don't push this. So he's much more complicated than a lot of people, I think, give him credit for. And he's immensely successful. He's successful when it comes to education. Tuskegee will end up educating countless students. And even today, he will also be instrumental in the formation of thousands of schools across the South for rural Black children, not just young Black people, but little kids. So he's pushing education. It's a certain kind of education, right? But he's pushing it. And for him, it's practical. He also is successful when it comes to his idea of economic success. He establishes what's called the National Business League. The National Business League is a coalition of Black businessmen and Black professionals who come together with others who are parts of other sorts of organizations to uplift Black people through economic success. This guy is successful not just in education and economy, but in politics to some degree. He makes some ties with prominent white folk, right? Businessmen, philanthropists, people who give money away, like Carnegie, sometimes called robber barons, right? So he makes connections with them. He makes connections with the president. He meets with people like Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who were both presidents, right? He actually dines at the White House with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is vilified for this, right? He's made into a villain by a lot of white people who don't like a Black man in the White House. Think about that for a moment. He's just there to eat meat. But Booker T is still going to be vilified by some people in the Black community at this time. A lot of northern Black newspapers criticize him and his approach. A lot of Black leaders voice open and consistent criticism. They call him a traitor to his race. In fact, in some places, they keep him from speaking publicly. In Boston, Black leaders come together when they know that Booker T is about to give a speech. They come together. And they come together and they heckle him. A heckler is somebody who stands in the crowd and talks to you while you're trying to, give your comedy routine or your speech or whatever, right? So they heckle him and they shut him down from speaking at a Black church where he wanted to go. And a fight breaks out, and then there's something that becomes known as the Boston Riot. Point is, this stuff gets serious. For these people who are doing the heckling, who are trying to shut him down, they're people who want to fight the power. They want uplift, for individual uplift, right? But they also want an end to segregation, and they push for both economic and success and social success, right? Jobs and equality. One of these men is a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. This guy becomes the preeminent Black intellectual of the early 20th century. He's, in fact, the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard, in history, by the way. He's the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard. And what he studies is the confluence of history and society, the intersection, the coming together of history and society. How, sort of a historical sociology, right? Historically, how have societies treated each other? And he teaches at Atlanta University, and he becomes forceful in his efforts to promote Black rights and Black education. So he's pushing for voting and office holding among Black people. He wants Black professionals and business owners to rise, and he also wants a certain kind of education, one that, in fact, is I don't know if the word opposite is quite the right way to phrase it, but one that is not about working with your hands, it's about working with your mind. He pushes a liberal arts education. He pushes an advanced technology education. So it's not about working with your hands, it's about thinking. In the liberal arts, you think about a variety of things, right? English, history, sociology, these kinds of things. And in advanced technical education, you're not just working with your hands, you're working with your mind. I'll give you an example. It's kind of like the difference between being an electrician and an electrical engineer, right? They're both dealing with similar sorts of matters, but the electrician is more hands-on, right, than is the engineer. My son, Gordon, he wants to be an engineer, and I keep telling him, you got to do the math, and he's very good at it. He's very bright, but he likes shortcuts. And I keep telling him, hey, you need to work harder at this. And I said, look, if you never become an electrical engineer and you like working with your hands, there's nothing wrong with being an electrician. It's not that I'm trying to down him, but it's also that there's nothing wrong with this. And in today's society, a lot of young people don't want to work with their hands. They, unfortunately, society sees this as this sort of manual labor. A lot of people tend to look down upon it. But I tell my son, if you want it, this is what you need to do. And sometimes he does it, and sometimes he doesn't. When it comes to education, he talks about the talented 10th. Now, this is a term that's not coined by him. He doesn't make it up. This term, the talented 10th, is actually coined by a white man who promotes education of Black people at this time. But Du Bois, he runs with it. He writes an essay of the same name, as you can see, the talented 10th. And the idea is this: 10% of Black men, he really would have said Black men. Maybe he meant Black people, but that's how people talk. 10% of Black men could succeed in an academically rigorous education. 10% of Black men can become an inspiration to others. They can be leaders of the movement. So this idea of a talented 10th, 1 out of every 10 Black people, I suppose, can in fact rise and help others rise. Of course, we can say, well, what do you mean only 1 out of 10? Why not 2 out of 10? Of course, this is abstract. And so he's forceful in his anti-accommodationism. He believed that accommodationism involves giving up a great deal. You relinquish a solid academic education. You relinquish political power. You relinquish equality. You even relinquish personal freedom, the choice to do what you want to do. No, you can think, you can work with your mind. You don't have to fit the Booker T model. Remember, Booker T's approach, as far as Du Bois is concerned, Booker T's approach, and I think there's something to this, it places the burden only on the backs of Black folks. You can change, but don't ask others to change. Du Bois says this burden placed on black people is wrong because the post-slavery racist system is in fact a national issue. We all have our hands in this. It is not just for the individual black person to help himself. It's broader than that and it's deeper than that. And you cannot sit by on the sidelines the way Booker T wants you to do. Sit on the sidelines, do for yourself, practice, 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 and just wait to play. For Du Bois, this takes too long. He says Booker T's approach will create a population of black workers, and that's all they're going to be, because black workers will have children that they will teach to be black workers, who will then have children who they will teach to be black workers. If you're never fighting to rise, then you're always, as a community, going to stay in place. You're never going to get to the top of the professions. And he brings all these ideas together in a book that he writes called The Souls of Black Folk in the early, like 1903 or so. And so Du Bois is writing books, he goes on speaking tours, he actually helps found organizations as well, organizations that are dedicated to his vision. He starts an organization called the Niagara Movement. He and other black leaders meet in Niagara Falls, Canada, and they wish to form an organization dedicated to national civil rights of black people. He's talking about a national thing here. He wants greater voting rights. He wants equality in education, integration of public facilities, right? They talk about, not being passive. They talk about being manly and standing up for your rights. And he did say manly. He called it manly agitation. You must be a manly agitator, somebody who actually demands something. You don't just sit by and wait for somebody to throw you some crumbs. There's no throwing down your bucket here, right? There is about rising. Now, excuse me. Again, this is a national sort of vision that he has. But this vision founders pretty quickly. The Niagara Movement founders pretty quickly. It is plagued by internecine squabbles. That just means they fight each other, right, amongst themselves. These internecine fights, there's a lack of funding, right? They have no real support from a lot of black people in the community who follow, or white people who like Booker T's model. But the Niagara Movement sets a precedent, right? And a stage for, and people take notice. Later on, the same kinds of people come together and they found the NAACP. The NAACP is, of course, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And let me just give you some background on how this happens. There are a lot of race riots against black people in urban centers right around early 1900s. There's a lot of racial tensions, economic tensions in cities, sexual tensions, because black men are sometimes accused of they're often unjustly accused of raping white women. This happens actually in Atlanta in like 1908-09, where a black man is unjustly accused of raping a white woman, and the rioters, a white riot, actually breaks out. And these riots inspire white and black reformers to actually form interracial organizations to push for an end to Jim Crow. The NAACP starts as a strong interracial movement, and it's still that way to some degree. But these people want, of course, is an end to segregation. They want greater personal liberties. And so they meet and they form the NAACP. It's the leading civil rights organization of the era, probably even today. And it engages at higher levels. For example, it files suits to end Jim Crow. For example, I can't remember what year it was, early 1900s. It files, I think it was early 1900s, it doesn't matter, circa 1900. It files a suit in Oklahoma to overturn the grandfather clause. Remember the grandfather clause, which said that if your grandfather voted, then you don't have to pay poll taxes. If your grandfather voted, you don't have to pay a literacy. You don't have to take a literacy test. Of course, this left out a lot of black people. So the NAACP files suit, and the Supreme Court overturns the Oklahoma law, the grandfather clause. So what you see is more black men voting. And this is just an example. And you're going to see the NAACP get involved in these things later on, especially in the 1950s and 60s. And so the NAACP has various tactics. It also investigates and reports on black struggles in a newspaper called The Crisis. The Crisis reports on lynchings and voter suppression efforts. It prints op-eds, which are opinion editorials about lynching, voter suppression, basically all issues relevant to the black community and their allies. And they're forming this sort of national, and as it says, the National Association. So it's no longer local. They're talking about a national sort of movement. They're talking about black people in a national sense, shaping a more modern black identity. And in fact, it goes beyond that. Du Bois actually helped shape a sense of a larger black community on the international scale. People like him join in what becomes known as Pan-Africanism. Pan, like panorama, right? A wide sort of scope. And Pan-Africanism is about international black identity. There's this idea that the struggle of black people anywhere is the struggle of black people everywhere. So, for example, they say that racism around the world and the ideas of black inferiority and of political black people's supposed inferiority socially, naturally, and politically, that when you see this around the world, it is simply a mirror image of what you see in the United States. So they think that, they say through this Pan-Africanist movement, that you have to actually stop racism everywhere if you want to stop it anywhere. They also push back against colonialism in Africa, because by the early 1900s, Africa is bombarded, really overrun by Europeans, right? You know, the English, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, they're cutting it all up. And they push back against this idea that Europeans have, and even some Africans have at this time, that colonialism of this sort, it actually civilizes African people. There's a lot of people in the early 1900s who say, oh, it's good for Europeans to go in there because African people are backwards. Of course, they're not seeing, in fact, that what they're doing to them is actually destabilizing and sort of destabilizing society, their economy, their whole world. In fact, is adding to the degeneration, or at least causing the degeneration. But people believe, oh, we need to be there. This, of course, is part of the whole white man's burden scenario, a form of thinking that we talked about before. The idea that white men must uplift others. It is their burden. Now, Pan-Africanists, they will hold international conferences where they come together and they talk about these issues, and they showcase and celebrate the successes of black people around the world. Meanwhile, Du Bois remains hostile to Booker T's approach while he's doing all these things. But we have to put these guys kind of side by side a little bit and look at their varying circumstances. W.B. Du Bois, he was born into a free family, a family that had been free for generations. Booker T was born a slave. So they come from different backgrounds. And by the way, I was watching a show last night called Finding Your Roots. It's a PBS show with Henry Louis Gates. And what he does is he investigates, the lives of people. He started with only black people, but he does other people as well. And I was watching it last night, and he was actually showcasing several black people, And it occurs to me, and this is true, but I remember that Black people who today tend to be successful, like Bryant Gumbel, right? Maybe familiar with him, um, who tend to be successful are almost always um, descended from free Black people or people who were freed early on. Not always, but usually so. Anyway, W.E.B. Du Bois, he's born into a free family, had been free for generations already by the time he's born in the 1800s. So he already has a step up. He also lives in the North. He lives in a solid Black community, I think Massachusetts. He's not operating in the South where things are more violent. Booker T lives in the Deep South. The people he wants to help live in the Deep South. So these two, they bring different perspectives because they come from different worlds, I think, but both contribute to the struggle. Each identifies a vehicle for rising. On the one hand, this idea of vocational training and individual uplift. On the other, intellectual academic pursuits and collective uplift. Now, both of these kind of point to the same idea of of a collective rising, but for Booker T's perspective, it seems that would go more slowly. But there's still both of them offering a sense of hope for Black people. Both of them speak to the power of individual success and collective success. Both of them talk about individual responsibility and morality and all these things. And they both reflect how civil rights, really in the struggle for rights, is not a recent phenomenon. We've seen that this struggle is ongoing since the very beginning, since the slave rebellions aboard ships, and of course into the Stoner Rebellion, and later Gabriel and Denmark Vesey, and of course Nat Turner, all these people, until the 1900s, when we see people are still struggling in new ways. So, excuse me, the Black fight for civil rights will take on actually an added importance as Black people migrate at the end of the 1800s. In the time of the Civil War, it begins, right? During the Civil War era, we saw contrabands, especially leaving the South, running over to the Union side. After the war, we saw with Reconstruction, people actually moving around, searching for family, coming out of the South, searching across the country, looking for a better life, looking for family members. They're moving into cities in the South, in the West, and the North. There's an urbanization movement here. And of course, they are migrating for better lives. And in fact, it's the reason that in all human existence, people have moved from one geographical area to another. It's the reason that you see a lot of Africans coming, out of Africa and going across the Mediterranean, and sometimes dying on these makeshift boats, trying to get to places like Italy and Spain and Greece. It's why people come from Honduras, Guatemala, these places where it's dangerous just to live day to day. They come through Mexico, they come to the southern border of the United States. So it's for these reasons, right? There's always push and pull factors, something that's pushing them out. For example, in Central America, gangs and poverty. Here in the United States, you see a lot of Black people leaving the South because they want to escape all the bad stuff that's going on in the South. So a lot of Black people are seeking to leave the South. Now, what's interesting is they don't all want to go, they don't all want to stay in the United States. A lot of them will engage in colonization. Now it's them doing it. with the support of some white people still. But a lot of these people want to leave. In fact, what happens in the era of Reconstruction, especially thereafter, shortly thereafter, is is a push that people begin to call the Back to Africa movement. Back to Africa. These people believe the United States will never fully accept them. Okay? Just like the old movement, where white people were pushing colonization, these people, black people themselves, are like, you know what? They're never going to accept us. We are not, quote, Americans. We are seen as inferior beings. We have the right to live and be happy, but they don't want that for us here. So we should leave. We should go back to Africa. Now, of course, the word back is problematic because these people had been in the United States for generations. At the same time, they believe they can not only will they be living happier in Africa, they believe they can benefit Africa. Africa at this time is struggling under colonization. And a lot of black people in the United States see Africans as backwards. They come to believe what a lot of white people believe, that is that African people are uncivilized. They need some Christianity in their lives. And so a lot of these people, quote, go home. Several thousand in the late 1800s. They want to build a new black nation. Remember Liberia? That's still there. So a lot of them flow there. But even when they're there, in places like Liberia, they encounter a lot of conflict. There's a strong ethnocentrism between the arrivals and the native Liberians. There's conflict. Each thinks the other is sort of lesser than. Now, from the point of view of white people, they look at these people and they think, well, you're all black, you belong together. But from the point of view of these people themselves, they recognize differences. These people in Liberia had been there for some time already. Remember, Liberia actually is founded like in the 1820s. So it's been there for about 80 years, a couple generations already. They've already sort of settled in. And they can, you know, a lot of these native Liberians, they now control power sources. They control politics. They control the economy. And very often they would discriminate against these new arrivals. And so these new arrivals will often suffer unemployment. They die in large numbers. First of all, they're not really used to the climate. They're not really used to the diseases that are in Africa. So a lot of them die, and they die not just from disease, but from hunger sometimes, impoverishment at least. Disease actually makes hunger and malnourishment actually makes disease more, makes it more likely that disease will do you in the end. So these people, they quote, go home, but they experience a lot of problems in Africa. The movement is not really much of a success, but the movement will take off again in the 1920s, where you're going to see a new, renewed Back to Africa movement. We'll talk about that later. Most people, by far, they want to stay in the United States. They believe this is their home. They helped build it. So a lot of rural Southerners are fleeing the South. They're leaving the farm life behind. You know, the life of a hired farmhand is harsh. Men are doing the hard field work. Wives usually have to do that field work as well, working alongside their husbands, but very often they're also doing the domestic stuff. These jobs in the domestic sphere are highly coveted, right? A lot of people want them. They don't want to be working in the fields. Point is, these farm people and these workers, even if they're domestic workers, they're largely poor, they're largely uneducated, they're largely unnourished, or at least undernourished and undereducated. But a lot of these people who flee this area, they believe they can do better. They have this hope in what becomes known as the New South, the New South. It's an idea in the late 1800s that's pushed by progressives. Progressives are people, of course, who want to change, to reform the nation. And in the South, you have progressives who talk about a new Southern economy. They want to change from an agricultural economy to one based more on industry and business, like the North. They see this as the future. They don't want a plantation-based economy, especially one that's actually a monoculture economy. Monoculture is just a fancy way of saying that your economy is based on one thing and one thing only. In their case, it was cotton. And it's still largely cotton, even in the later years of the 1800s. But people who buy into this idea of the New South believe that they need to get away from that, because think about what monoculture does. When you only have your entire economy and even your society revolves around the not just the development but the production of a single thing, in this case a single crop, right? Cotton. Then that means that your economy is not diversified, and if something happens to that crop, if something happens to that one economic sort of item that you have, if nobody wants it anymore, then your entire economy is shot, because nobody wants it. Or what happens if prices fall, right? Which is really what happens. Prices fall, there's competition out there, and so societies that are based on monoculture don't survive long. And so a lot of people recognize this in the South, and they are, people who want the New South to rise, be more advanced, have a much more varied economy. And they believe that industry and business will create new factory jobs, will create new jobs in the building of infrastructure. You need people to build roads, build bridges, these kinds of things. And so what you see is that tens of thousands of Black men and women and children are flowing into southern cities. They're going to places like Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia. And when they're there, they're enjoying the benefits of a Black community. There is a strong Black culture and community in these urban centers. It's no longer a culture that is slave-based. It's not rural. We're going to come back to this because this is much more salient, meaning more obvious in the North. But even in southern cities, you're starting to see the formation of a Black urban culture. And the people who go to these southern cities will enjoy the networks of Black folk that are there. They get health care, right? Black doctors and dentists. They get legal advice, Black lawyers or college graduates who help, right? They get help with Black insurance companies, Black teachers, Black unions. And so what you're seeing here is a very particular local Black economy that exists unto itself. W.E.B. Du Bois calls this, quote, a closed economic circle. A closed economic circle. On the inside, it's Black people dealing with Black people. And then you have outsiders. Much the same way that white folk have it, because a lot of the white folks aren't dealing with Black people, so these people are going to do their own thing. You're not going to see a lot of white lawyers or doctors or teachers who want to deal with Black folk. So they form their own economy. There's this idea, support Black business only, because that's how the white folk are doing it. Of course, we don't do it that way today, but back in the day, they had to. So you see in these closed economic circles, you see Black businesses springing up, only dealing with each other. So you see tailors and grocers, undertakers, doctors, teachers, bankers, lawyers, barbers, all these people. And of course, journalists tying it all together with the Black voice. And so it's a tightly knit community, and undergirding all of this also is a tightly knit religious community. And so they're coming together and they're benefiting from urban life, but they're also contributing to the growth of cities with their manual labor and, of course, with their growth in professions. They're pumping money into these cities. And of course, they're living better lives generally. They have the benefits of goods and services that they wouldn't ordinarily have. I mean, living in the country can be tough, if you like, a varied diet, so to speak, right? My wife lived out by Abilene, which is smaller than Fort Worth, and she actually lived in a very small town about half an hour out of Abilene. And my wife has to be in a special diet. She's, got, what she calls gut issues, right? Digestive issues. It's nothing gross. It's just that she has problems with absorbing certain nutrients. She's got celiac disease, which means that she can't eat gluten, and it's not because it's trendy. It's because her healthcare demands it. Point being, when she lived outside of Abilene, it was very difficult for her to get the sorts of things that she needed, right? these rural areas aren't really known for their hipster kinds of gluten-free stuff, right? She moved, of course, over here with me, and we have all these grocery stores around the way, and she loves cooking Mexican food. She's actually writing up her own cookbook, and hopefully that'll come out soon. But point is, they're living better lives, these Black folk, because of the varied goods and services that city life offers. And of course, they're getting, these are private services, right? Groceries and food stores, and well, that's the same thing, groceries and other things, but also some public services, because there are churches and schools there with a strong Black community that engage in education and feeding the poor and helping you find jobs. All of this is similar to the settlement house movement of the North, notice. Of course, in these cities, it's still the South, and they experience a lot of racism and hostility. For example, in Richmond, Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia is sort of a microcosm of all this. It's a prime example. By 1900, Richmond, Virginia is a large city, and it's got a large Black community in the city. It's networked, it's developing, even thriving, with a growing Black middle class. But there's still segregation. So in 1904, the streetcar company in Richmond announces it's going to segregate all streetcars. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson was like 1896, right? So you're going to see these Jim Crow laws really taking off in the years following that, in the early 1900s, right around 1900. And so the streetcar company in Richmond decides it's going to segregate all of its streetcars, and the Black community is like, no. They hold rallies, they have boycotts. They end up losing. But these urban Black folk, even in the South, are starting to stand on their own 2 feet, even as the ground continues to shift beneath them. Now, a lot of people decide they're not going to move to the cities. They're going to move out west. They're going to move to the western areas. This happens during Reconstruction, when a lot of people are flowing westward, countless migrants. And this movement of Black folk, and the movement generally of people, is going to create conflict. Remember, settlers, mostly white, are going to encounter, or going to actually tread upon, ancient territories that are held by Native folks. And this conflict is going to actually it's going to result in violence, right? Clashes back and forth. And it will inspire the federal government to use soldiers, in particular Black soldiers, to push back these Native people. And so you see a lot of Black men going west as part of the military to serve in the military posts. They usually serve in the cavalry, right, riding horses, or the infantry. These are the frontline troops. These men, of course, become known as the Buffalo Soldiers. They're named so by the Native peoples out there because largely of their hair texture, right? And for the Native peoples, they think, well, they have hair like buffalo. These guys are going to be on the front line in the fight to win the West. They will be part of what becomes known as the Great Plains Wars, or the Indian Wars. The Great Plains, as you can see here, in the center of the country, right? And there's that inset there that I put up there, where you can see kind of the states that it covers today. This is land where the Great Plains, where countless Native peoples roamed, living lives, not just roaming around doing nothing. They had a proper civilization out there. And so the Indian Wars will, of course, result in the destruction of tribal life. It will result in the taking of land from Native peoples, and result in the deaths of thousands, countless thousands of them. Of course, white people will be killed as well, but nowhere near the number of people that are killed, not just by warfare, but by disease that is being brought over by the Europeans, by the white folk, I mean. And it had been brought over by Europeans since the early settlement. Now, the use of Black soldiers in this way is common. First of all, this is dangerous, deadly work. And you're going to see this over and over again in the wars that we see later on, where Black men will be put on the front line. So it's dangerous, deadly work, and few of them become officers. Now, some of them do, but most are assigned to the front line. And because of this, a lot of them will earn prestigious awards. Nearly 10 Black men will earn the prestigious award, the Medal of Honor, sometimes called the Congressional Medal of Honor, but no, the Medal of Honor. They will win this out there on the Great Plains. And if you think about why is it that so many Black men are earning this, it's because this sort of award is given to someone who really exhibits tremendous courage under fire. And because they're being put on the front line, it's like you're either going to survive or you're going to die. And if you survive, you're a hero because we didn't think you'd make it. It's a little bit simplistic to put it that way, but you get the point. They are put in very dangerous positions. And of course, nature being nature, people don't like to die. They, of course, will pull themselves up and will fight, bitterly, and often will come out heroes. But it's a rough life. You're out there, you're living on a remote military post. There's very few women. It's usually men out there out west. Now, in the beginning, it's pretty much all men, but later on, you will see Black soldiers bringing their wives, their families, and these Black soldiers, when it comes to their duty in the military, it's going to be all in the West. All in the West. Unlike white soldiers who will come out there and then be rotated back east, Black soldiers will remain on the front lines in the West. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it's to minimize racial tensions because these are Black men in uniform and there are fewer white people out west. And in fact, the white people out there will appreciate their presence because they need protection from natives. So there may be something to that. But this is also part of what we've seen throughout history, the use of non-white people to fight other non-white people. Let non-whites kill non-whites. This is something that is, it can't, if you're looking funny, it can't be denied because this is how it's done. And it's interesting, you see this a lot with the Native folks as well. And of course, Native people knew how other Native people fought. So there's also a strategic sort of element to all of this. But there's also this idea of put them out there first, right? And let them kill each other. These Black men, these Buffalo Soldiers, they're proud of their service. They see themselves as the point of the spear pointed at the West. It is they who win the West. It is they who make it safe for white settlement. This is how they see themselves, as instrumental in winning the West, as they put it, how the West was won. So you see a lot of Black soldiers coming out there, but the West is also a place for Black settlement. You're going to see a lot of Black people settle out in the Dakotas and Kansas, all the way to California, but a lot of Black people go to Kansas, and they establish all Black towns in Kansas, where they have businesses and schools and newspapers, banks, hotels, Black public officials running the place. You see this in places like Kansas. You see this in places like Oklahoma. An example of this is the town of Nicodemus, Kansas, which you can see here, which was a thriving Black town in the late 1800s. And you're going to see this, between the end of the Civil War and the early 1920s, dozens of all Black towns will dot the Great Plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, all that area. And tens of thousands of Black people will leave the South for these towns. And like a lot of white folk, they come for the opportunity, right, and land. Black people are going to be encouraged in a particular way by men like Benjamin Singleton, called Pap. Benjamin Pap, he believes that the only thing that is going to raise people, Black people, is ownership of land. That's the only thing, because money, of course, can flow through your fingers, but land is something that belongs to you. And so he publishes papers to get the word out, like essays and pamphlets, where he talks about land and freedom out west. And he, in fact, encourages a lot of these people to flow out west. And that's why he's called the Moses of the colored Exodus. Exodus, of course, which means exit. And it comes from the Bible, right? The first book of the Old Testament. That's not right. Genesis is. Exodus is maybe the. Oh, you can tell me. It's been a long time since I read the Bible. But Exodus, of course, has to do with the leaving, the escape, really, the flight of the Jews from human bondage in Egypt. And I think Exodus is actually the last book of the Old Testament. But I can't be sure. I'm sure I can look it up. Whatever. So they are called, he is called the Moses of the colored Exodus. And so Black migrants are therefore called exodusters. These are people who exit the South and go into these dusty lands, right? If these are, later on, we'll see how the Dust Bowl and all of that affects people during the Great Depression. But this is a place where, it's largely flat, lots of dust. And so they're called exodusters. And a lot of these people become part of small Black towns. Others just become farmers out in the middle of nowhere. And so they are inspired, these exodusters, by people like Pap, but they're also cashing in on something, and that is the Homestead Act. In 1862, there was a federal law that gave or sold on the cheap land, plots of land, like 160 acres or so, to individuals, more for families. Point is, who cares about the numbers? You get a lot of land out there, basically for just going out there. Plots of land. It's a federal law, so Black people qualify. Remember, the federal government has of course, it could do otherwise. It will do otherwise, but at this time, at least, after the 1860s and after the Civil War, especially during Reconstruction, you see a lot of Black men flowing out there, taking advantage of the Homestead Act because, of course, the Republicans who are anti-slavery at this time during the Reconstruction period, they, of course, would apply this to Black men who wanted to succeed out west. And so a lot of Black people qualify under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, under the federal government's push to help people of color back then, Black people in particular. And so these men get plots of land. It's either free or low cost. Whatever, the point is this: you must work it, usually for like 5 years. Once you work it for 5 years, it doesn't matter how you got it, whether you got it free or low cost, it's yours. And so thousands and thousands of Black folk flow westward. And like most farmers out there, they're poor. They're often very poor. You get this idea of people going out there and making it, but these people live hand to mouth, and they live at the whim of Mother Nature. A storm comes by, locusts come by, you have an early freeze. You're just one crop away from hunger, maybe even starvation. They're at the whim of Mother Nature, but they're also at the whim of a growingly complex economy. A growingly complex economy that's tied now by railroads across the country, right? And so they, of course, are not just competing with local farmers, which is going to be difficult enough because there are some large corporate farms out there that have a lot of money because they have investors. And these people, Black and white homesteaders, have a very difficult time competing out there because of the large farms that are already out there and because of the railroads tying the economy together. But a lot of these people will eventually own their land outright. Now, most of them don't. They end up working for others. But a lot of them do. The West is a place for some Black success. Even if you don't make it as a homesteader, there's work out there for you. And Black women do various jobs. A lot of Black women will be teachers or farmers' wives or journalists or domestic workers or whatever, taking in washing. But not all of them are like that. Some Black women defy the norms out there. Some of them haul freight on wagons. So you have women out there. And in fact, you're going to more likely see a Black woman doing this than a white woman, because for a long time, heavy labor was associated with color, right? Especially Black women as opposed to white women. And so you're going to see Black women out there hauling freight with horse wagons, sometimes hunting gold, and eventually delivering mail, federal mail out there in the middle of nowhere. A prime example is this lady here, Mary Fields, who becomes known as Stagecoach Mary. This is the first Black woman to ever carry U.S. mail. She's doing it out west. She's the second woman altogether to carry mail out west. Second woman altogether and the first Black woman. And she's kind of like a man. You know, she often dresses like a man. She talks like a man, swears like a man, carries a gun. And as she's doing her rounds, she often has to fight off bandits who want to rob the mail. That was a thing back then. I think I posted an article on her. If I did, you should read it. If I didn't, don't worry about it. But I think I did. Most women, of course, aren't like this. Most women out there, including Black women, are just trying to make their lives. They're just trying to fit into the society out there and make their way. Black men, of course, have a variety of occupations as well. Some own farms, right? And a lot of Black farmers will actually, oops, I think that's the wrong picture. A lot of Black farmers will actually act cooperatively, because you're going to see farmers out west coming together and sometimes not, in fact, allowing Black farmers in. Black farmers out west form the Colored Farmers Alliance. The Colored Farmers Alliance is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a union of farmers that come together to assert their rights. You see this happening on the Great Plains in the late 1800s. You see it among white people with what's called the Granger movement, right? Where they form the Farmers Alliance. Well, these guys are the Colored Farmers Alliance. And like their white counterparts, these guys come together. They challenge railroads who want to charge too much for freight. They challenge grain elevator operators. These are the companies that store grain until the train comes by. They store them in those big silos or sometimes underground in these caverns, right? Where these elevators take the grain down. Anyway, whatever, not the point. The point is this, that these colored farmers come together in an alliance to push against the corporations that own the railroads and the grain elevator operators. But most of them end up working for others, most Black men, I should say. They work as fine farmhands, right? Some farmhands join the Colored Farmers Alliance, but usually not. A lot of these men will either be farmhands, these Black men, or ranch hands. Most men out west actually become farmhands, miners, or cowboys, whether they're Black or white, or Asian or Mexican, because the West in the late 1800s is a very, very diverse area. You see people coming from all over the world because the economy needs workers. And this is hard work. And excuse me, miners get paid a little extra, but it's dangerous work. And so you see a lot of different kinds of men engaging in this work. In fact, a huge one is cowboy or ranch hands. A lot of Black men are cowboys. About 25% of all cowboys are Black. The others were a mixed lot, Mexican, Chinese, Irish. This is not what people think of when they think of a cowboy. I mean, I live in Texas, and I can tell you that's not what people think of when they think of cowboys. But there's a strong cowboy heritage in the Black community that a lot of Black people don't even think about anymore. But the point is that there's a large mythology about what a cowboy looks like. Now, most of you probably are too young to remember the Marlboro Man, but this was a guy, right? You see him there. It was, not really the spokesman, and I don't think he ever said anything. Kind of just sat there, smoked a cigarette, and looked tough, right? But this is the image of the cowboy. And in fact, the image of the cowboy is quite different. If we look at reality, a lot of them look like this. This guy, in fact, was a famous cowboy. I'll get to him in a moment. But let's step back and ask ourselves, why is it that there was so much racial diversity among cowboys and ethnic diversity? You have to understand something. This was a hard life. Why would you want to be a cowboy? You're out there making a little bit of money it's lonely. There's nobody out there but you. Mostly, almost all men out there, right? Cowboys. I mean, have you seen Brokeback Mountain? Right? Not to be funny, but this is how. I mean, yeah, stuff happens, right? And so you see a lot of men out there where there's no women. This happens out west. It happens in prisons when there's no women, right? People get together. And so what you have here is a circumstance that is lonely and hard work. You're out there riding the range. You're driving cattle from state to state. This is long. You're out there in the middle of nowhere. You're sleeping with your head on a rock. There's a rattlesnake over there trying to get you. The point is that it's hard work. And so you're going to see a motley crew, meaning a sort of diverse group of people, black people and Mexican and Chinese and Irish working alongside each other and often in conflict with each other. Let's be real. But, men like Nat Love, they figure largely in popular culture and in what become known as Western dime novels at the time. These dime novels, they're called dime novels for a reason, right? And that is they cost a dime. And these are sort of the exploits of people out on the range. It's the reason that we think that the West was so wild and we have all these Westerns with Wild Wild West. It wasn't as violent as people thought, although it could be pretty lawless in some areas. But these dime novels, of course, would depict the lives. And, you can imagine, right? You're writing your life story or your memoir out there, or your autobiography, what have you. And you're going to embellish a little, right? You're going to kind of step it up a little. You want to make yourself look good. You want to sell stuff, right? You're trying to make money off of your story. So you're going to embellish a little. And so this is true of white cowboys and maybe even people who never went out there, but it is also true of black cowboys' autobiographies. This guy, Nat Love, is an example where he talks about his, fighting with native people. He talks about his, how he dealt with cattle stampedes and how Mother Nature was unforgiving, right? And later on, once the sort of cattle sort of boom dies off in the late 1800s, by about 1900, you're still going to see these themes in what become known as Wild West shows, like Wild Bill's Wild West show. And these are shows that feature cowboys and sometimes the Indians, so to speak. So cowboys and Indians. And in fact, they would have people like Nat Love. They would also have people like Geronimo. I'm pretty sure he was in there. These are native peoples famous for what happened in the 1800s, even with their their opposition to the U.S. military, but later on become hired as really characters and caricatures of Indian people, caricatures of native people, in order to sell tickets. And so there's shooting and there's rounding up and there's the whoop 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 and the cowboys and Indian shows, right? There's also cattle rustling. For example, this guy here, Bill Pickett, he's the very first steer wrestler, and he's from Texas, and Texas is huge. Every day down the road in Fort Worth, there's these stockyards. It's mostly touristy, but every day they still drive cattle through the streets of Fort Worth. And it's not really, it's kind of just like, it's nothing exciting. They just kind of like, and they're kind of moving and kind of moving through. A lot of them are bulls. They just kind of walk through. I've never seen anybody stampeded or anything. Everybody just kind of stays to the side. It's hot and the cattle just, can't be bothered to mess with anybody. But anyway, so Bill Pickett is the first steer wrestler. He comes out of Texas, and he comes up with this technique that you'll recognize. It's used in all these rodeos where you're riding your horse, chasing down a steer, right? Big horns, right? And you automatically dismount, and then you grab the steer by the horns and drag him down, right? You've seen this probably. If not, I'm sure you can YouTube it. But he invented that, Bill Pickett, and he becomes famous in the rodeo circles. So you have real life people out west who are making their mark from the black community. You also have men like Bass Reeves. Yeah, real life law enforcement officers. This guy was the first black deputy marshal, a federal agent, right? First black deputy marshal. And you may remember it's up to the marshals to catch fugitives, kind of like the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, right? If you've ever seen the movie, what's it called? Oh my goodness, I can't think of it right now. It's just slipped my mind. Harrison Ford. The sequel is called The Fugitive. What's the first one called? It's got Harrison Ford, and it's got that guy with the really craggly face. What's his name? It's got 3 names. Something, something, something. Tommy Lee Jones. Oh, it's about, a doctor who's accused of killing his wife and then gets chased down by the federal marshals. I can't believe I can't think of it. I had a brain freeze. Anyway, so he's the first black deputy marshal, and this guy brings in several thousand fugitives to justice out in the West. He's sent out there to capture them. You can imagine. In fact, I heard this. I don't know, so don't quote me on it. Won't be on the test, but I believe that he even pulled in his son, who was also a fugitive. So he brings in his own son, and if he does that, I think that's amazing. That's something. Whatever you think about it, it shows the kind of man that he was and that he wanted to be. Again, maybe even part of this whole politics of respectability, right? You cannot show favor. You must be better than others. Some people think also, and again, and that he inspired the TV Lone Ranger. Not sure if any of you are old enough to remember the Lone Ranger. You probably heard of him, right? He had Tano on the side, this native dude, and he rode a white horse named Silver, Hi-Yo Silver, and all that kind of stuff. This Lone Ranger wore like a blue outfit and like a black mask and a white hat. Right? Always the white hat, right? The white hat means you're a good guy. Black hat means you're a bad guy. Think about that for a moment. Anyway, the West is a place for these people, but it's also a place of conflict and hostility. There's a lot of problems out there. There is conflict over land, right? So you see people squatting, people settling. You see debates over who owns the land. You see squabbles and conflicts and killings over natural resources. Who's going to use the waterway, right? People trying to divert rivers, all of that. So it's, over land and natural resources. There's also, of course, interracial strife, because all the stuff about land ownership and natural resources generally involves different groups of people. You have native peoples out there who are using the land as they do. You have Mexican peoples out there who tend to be like sheep herders. You have white settlers who tend to be homesteaders and doing other things. You have Irish and Chinese workers who are, coming out. And so there's a lot of conflict, and there is segregation in these places like Kansas and so forth. Not as much as there is in the South, but still segregation exists, and violence is common. Lynchings are common. I'll give you an example. In 1885, in Dakota, at a place called Sturgis, a white mob lynches a black soldier, one of these Buffalo soldiers. And by the way, Sturgis, that might be familiar to you. Recently, they have a motorcycle rally there every year at Sturgis, Dakota. I think it's South Dakota, and so there was this question about whether or not it would become a super spreader event. Apparently, it did, but the governor of South Dakota, doesn't really, she talked about, how masks are sort of oppressive and so forth and so on. And she was not going to shut down things because of COVID. Anyway, that's kind of simplifying it. You can look it up yourself. But the point is, that's the same place. A white mob lynches a black soldier in Sturgis. And in retaliation, a couple of dozen black soldiers get on their horses and they shoot up 2 saloons that are patronized by white folk. And they end up killing one white bystander. And it seems that and so what happens is that the black community, the white community retaliates against these guys, and they end up lynching that soldier. So other soldiers. I mean, sorry, I'm kind of trying to do something. I'm having a technical problem here. Let me just kind of pause for a moment. Okay. All right. So let me just go over this again, because I think I might have misspoken. I was kind of, my attention was divided. So anyway, so a white mob lynches a black soldier. The black people retaliate. They shoot up, saloons, kill a white bystander. And it just, the initial guy who was lynched actually was accused of having killed a white man. Apparently he did. He was the town doctor. So, sometimes the people who are lynched, you got to be careful with what you say here, but because you have to be correct. And that is that some people, aren't necessarily innocent when they are lynched. Most of them are, or at least are brought up on trumped up charges. But nobody deserves this kind of frontier justice, right? If you kill somebody, the law says you're supposed to get a trial. They're not giving these men trials, right? So that's wrong. So there's violence, segregation. There's a general sense of white superiority out west, even over the black soldiers, as I sort of alluded to. Despite their service in the Union Army, despite their service in the Indian Wars, despite their service in later wars, these soldiers will experience racial hostility throughout the country. But again, as black people are leaving the South, they're going to cities in the South, but they're also, a lot of them, settling out west. But by and large, by far, most of them are going north. By the end of the 1900s, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. The United States, by 1900s, is really the most powerful manufacturing economy in the world. Factories are cropping up everywhere, in and around cities, in places like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Detroit. I took my family back to Cleveland. That's where I grew up. And I took them back to the old neighborhood. And it's interesting because on every street, you could have a row of houses, and then all of a sudden a factory, and then another row of houses, and then another factory on the end. There are factories all through the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood working factory, sort of a neighborhood of factory workers. These neighborhoods crop up all over the Midwest and northeastern cities. Factory on every corner. Today, these places have been turned into lofts, coffee shops, you can imagine, right? Because the industry in these northern, what are now called, it's now called the Rust Belt, because these places are sort of rusting out. They're dying since the 70s and 80s. They have been sort of refurbished, and they made into other things, stores. And my brother actually put his tattoo parlor in one. But anyway, I digress. So this is the Gilded Age. The late 1800s is the Gilded Age, where you see the economy booming, an increase in national wealth, a lot of jobs. But you also have, of course, the exploitation of workers, because competition is so tough here that and labor is usually the most expensive part of making anything. Therefore, you will try to cut costs. So you want your workers to have long hours and low wages and really bad conditions. You don't want to pay to make things safer because that costs money. And at the same time, a lot of these workers live in houses that are owned by the business owners, and they pay high wage. Even though they're getting low wages, they have to pay high rent. So they're being exploited, and they work in very dangerous jobs. Why? Because the government is on the side of business. The government wants business to make money for the nation, and work costs a lot of money. And therefore, you pay people, as labor costs a lot of money. Therefore, you pay them as little as possible, and you can compete in this economy. But it is creating jobs, especially in the North, better jobs than Black people have in the South. And because it's the North, it's a better place for them just generally. Not to say that things are perfect in the North, they are not. People get lynched in the North. But if we're making comparisons, we have to say the South is worse by far. But these factory jobs, right, or these factories are engaged in mass production. Boom, 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 right? They're going 24/7 with 3 shifts a day and all that kind of stuff, constantly pumping out. And in the North, in some of these towns, there's a perpetual sort of hazy gray orange hue over the city, because the smokestacks are always going, and that's how they like it. People didn't care about the environment so much, and their health was like, okay, whatever, I need something to eat, right? And so you see these jobs that are mass production jobs you're also, by the way, going to see mass consumption on the other side, people buying these products, right? So things are changing. So this is part of the Gilded Age. Another thing that's part of the Gilded Age is city corruption. You're going to see a lot of city leaders and state leaders and government leaders generally sort of in bed with business. And part of this is going to actually manifest itself. All of this is going to manifest itself. The corruption, the mass production, the low wages, all of that is going to manifest itself in the influx of what become known as new immigrants. New immigrants, especially after 1880. No longer so much. I mean, they're coming from Ireland still, but the Irish came here in the 1840s. These new immigrants are from Europe, Eastern Europe, where you see Russians and Jews and Slovak people coming from there, and then you have Southern Europeans, which is really the Italians, and they come here because companies want them. It's cheap labor. Why pay a homegrown white dude to do this when I can pay a Italian to do this? He's darker skinned and he doesn't want as much money because he's lucky to have what he has here. This is going to create a lot of conflict, obviously. And a lot of people in the United States are going to like the fact that immigrants are coming in. Now, it's kind of hard to make out in this cartoon here, but at the top, you see Russia. On the left of Russia, you see the name Italy, and you see Hungary, and then you see Austria, places like this. These are all, European cities. And you see these immigrants coming in. At the bottom, it talks about how the United States is a sewer, a dumping ground of sorts for all these different people. So, this idea of being a land of opportunity for immigrants and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of mythology revolving around that. The reason so many immigrants came is because of the push and pull. A lot of problems back home, but also here, you're going to have all these jobs. You're going to have government promoting it and businesses wanting it. That is cheap labor. But again, you're going to see a lot of people like the author of this cartoon who are called nativists, right? To be a nativist is to mean that you are someone who does not want people who don't belong here in the country. And to belong here, you have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, as I think we've mentioned before, the WASP phenomenon. You have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, right? So there's a racial thing there. There is an ethnicity thing there, and there is a religious thing there. And on top of that, you had to have been born here. Otherwise, you're not native in the eyes of these people. If you ever want to see, this in action, watch the movie Gangs in New York. It's fantastic. Long, but it's epic. Anyway, Bill the Butcher. I think it's Bill the Butcher. I don't remember, but that guy's cool. Daniel Day-Lewis. Can't go wrong. Anyway, so these people are coming from all over the world at the same time that black men and women from the South are flowing to the North for jobs and opportunities, right? And so, like their European counterparts, these black people are going to engage in what's called chain migration. Usually the first people to move from one place to the other are men, usually young men. They're the first ones to go. And then they start bringing people over. They write home and talk about how great it is. They say, I have a job for you. You can stay with me. This is chain migration. It's as old as humans, right? And so you see this, people coming from the South via chain migration, people coming from Europe via chain migration. Today, people come from all parts of the world via chain migration. And what's interesting is out of the South, people are flowing out of the South because railroads and business owners are promoting it. Again, they want cheap labor. It's not that they care about these black folk, but they want cheap labor. And so railroads are giving group rates. Very often, these railroads are in cahoots with business owners who want people delivered to them. And so they will give group rates or family rates, and business owners will promise to hire entire families sometimes, which they do. They will hire an entire family, whether it's immigrant or black or whatever. And of course, that's good because everybody has a job, but it's also bad because you need to behave yourself. If any one of you is late too often, you're all fired, right? So that's a problem. But you see a lot of people thinking, I'm going to take my chances. Black people will embrace this idea. They will flow to the north, but they will be placed at the bottom, even under Europeans who just got here. The Irish and the Italians, they automatically assume they're higher level than these people who are darker skinned and who, of course, are just rising from slavery. And so they think of themselves, these Europeans, as higher level. And in fact, a lot of white people, a lot of white business owners will give jobs to the immigrants before they give them to black people. So it's going to be very, very hard for black people to break in. If in fact they do end up working in a factory, they will end up doing jobs like cleaning. Most of the time, you're not going to see a black man working a factory job other than cleaning something. And the other thing is that these Europeans, over time, they fare much better because, honestly, they can mix in with a generation, within a generation. They can achieve what is becoming known as whiteness at this time. Within a generation, right? You're going to see an Irish guy marry an Irish girl. Both of them may be off the boat, but they're going to give birth to an Irish baby who speaks English in a way that is perhaps a little bit different from how the parents spoke it. Over time, they mix in. That's not going to happen with black folk because there are laws against interracial marriage in a lot of these states, of course, the South, but also interracial marriage is just socially frowned upon. Not only de jure, but de facto segregation. Point is, black people aren't really going to intermarry so much with other races, especially white people at this time. And so they're creating this sort of community unto themselves. Meanwhile, white immigrants who are coming in, they're eventually achieving whiteness and moving up. Now, whatever you think about immigration, think of things this way. I often hear people say, oh, why is it that people just cannot seem to rise? This community of people has been here for so long and they just never rise. Well, they might add, oh, my granddaddy came here from Italy in 1905 and he had $1 in his pocket and look, he made it. Well, yeah, again, he probably got a job fresh off the boat that they're going to hire him before they hire a black person. And he and the Irish fellow can actually mix in within a generation or so. So, it's a little bit more complicated than some people make it out to be. So the Gilded Age is marked by all of this, right? It's marked by competition, sure, wealth, but and all that, but it's marked by competition, conflict, and strife. You have rich versus poor. You have black versus white versus brown versus yellow, I guess, to put it badly, but you know what I mean. You have all these people that are looking at each other in this way. And so you have rich versus poor, people of different color looking at each other weirdly. You have workers versus employers. Labor unions, right? They come together and they want better wages. There's strength in numbers, they believe. They want shorter hours, right? Because the average workday was, 10, 12, 16 hours a day sometimes. If you didn't like it, there's an immigrant coming right off the boat who'll take it. What are you going to do about it? Right? Your pay is also very low and your conditions are very, very poor. And so these labor unions want better wages, safer conditions, higher pay. They want what's by this time known as an 8-hour day. Today, our work week is based on 8 hours. Right? Some people work more than that, but it is based on an 8-hour, 40-hour work week. And there's overtime that comes in under the federal government. You get paid overtime, right? Under federal law and usually state law too. But that's something that had to be fought for. And so you see unions rising at this time. Now, black men try to join these unions, but very often they're not. Very often they're kept out. So they form their own unions. For example, the Colored National Labor Union. The Colored National Labor Union is founded in 1869. And of course, with the flow of people into the North from the South, black people, you're going to see a lot of the membership rise. And again, these people are usually not accepted into the other unions. An exception to that is the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor are also founded in 1869, and their goal is to unite what they call the toiling masses. Everybody who works. For them, it's broad-based. If you're a worker, we want you. Now, if you were a white-collar worker, if you were like a lawyer or something, they don't want you. They want the toiling masses, people who go home dirty, sweaty, and with their back hurting, basically. That's who they want. And they want them from all walks of life, except the Chinese. They never want to accept the Chinese. I guess you got to have a scapegoat, but they never want the Chinese. And at first, they don't even accept women, but they accept black men from the very beginning. The Knights of Labor, like other unions, they're pushing for the 8-hour day. They want an end to child labor. They want an end to convict labor, an end to Chinese labor, because they see this as competition, right? Cheaper competition. So it's not that they care about kids or convicts or whatever. It's like they don't want to have to, their wages would be better if there were no such thing as child labor or convict labor or Chinese labor. By the way, it's one of the reasons that we don't have child labor today, because unions are like, child labor means I have lower pay, because children are usually paid lesser because they're not heads of the family, right? Women were also paid lesser as well. So there's a lot of push against women workers as well. But anyway, the Knights of Labor is one of these few groups that actually accepts black people. After 1890, by the way, so there are other groups too, more radicals that accept black people too, but the Knights of Labor is a huge one. And by 1892, the Knights of Labor really becomes more of a black union, because you see the government and employers cracking down. Their efforts to paint the Knights as socialists, anarchists, right? Dangerous, violent people. Because of this, because of these efforts by government and employers to paint these people, these Knights, as socialists and anarchists, a lot of people turn their backs on the Knights of Labor. And in fact, a lot of white workers leave. White skilled workers leave. And the skill, and it's really about skills. So, but it becomes about race, because new unions that are formed by white folk, by the way, just the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, doesn't matter. The point is, unions like that want skilled workers only because they believe skilled workers have more juice, right? More negotiating power. So they don't want unskilled workers, and so skilled workers leave the Knights. They form new unions, and because they're skilled, they tend to be white. That just kind of comes along with it, because a lot of black workers are not skilled, right? Because they just, remember, they're just rising from slavery and so forth. Once this becomes more of a black union, you will see that they have less power. The government cracks down on them more heavy-handedly, more violent. And over time, you're going to see a deep sort of division between black and white unions. Now, this is after 1892, and of course you see Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, just to kind of throw in a little sort of by the way kind of thing, right? So in the 1890s, when there were these sorts of connections between white and black workers, and perhaps a future of solidarity, of coming together, you're going to see all this dissolving by the late 1800s. But you will see, as you see with the colored unions, right, the the Knights of Labor eventually, and the Colored National Labor Union, you see that black people are fighting for their rights as humans, as citizens, as laborers. And after 1914, you're going to see things heat up in the North, because the population of black migrants explodes in the North, where you're going to see people flocking to northern cities from all over the place, white, black, everybody. And of course, this is going to create problems, because you're going to see people who have to deal with each other who never would have dealt with each other before. What's causing this huge influx of people to the North? World War I has begun in Europe. You have the Allies versus the Central Powers, not the Axis, that's World War II. Allies versus Central Powers. I'm not going to go deeply into it, but you're going to see, kind of like, on the Allied side, the French, the English. On the Central Power side, you're going to see, Germany, Austria, whatever. The United States is going to be neutral at first, for the first 3 years or so. When this war jumps off in 1914, we remain neutral. We want to do business with both sides, and we do. We sell food, we make loans, we ship all kinds of metal goods. The United States is making money off this war, making bank. It's one of the reasons that we get into the war later on. I can't go into it, but really one of the reasons we go into it is because of all that investing that we did in the war. There was really no sort of sublime, highfalutin um, sort of objective here. Although Woodrow Wilson will say, "Yeah, we're entering to make the world safe for democracy." What we were doing really is making the world safe for our money, to be quite honest. But anyway, that's a whole different lesson. Let's talk about how this affects Black people, right? So because the United States is making bank, its manufacturing base is booming, its agricultural base is booming, and the new economy needs cheap labor, especially because immigration from Europe has slowed, because the war causes a decrease in immigration, right? Because a lot of men stay home to fight for their country. A lot of men stay home because they don't, or a lot of people stay home because they don't want to risk getting shot up in the middle of the Atlantic. Point is, Black people are needed more than before. And so you're going to see them flocking to northern cities. They're going to leave behind their sharecropping. They're going to leave behind their tenant farming, their Jim Crow laws, although that's, there is Jim Crow in the North. They're going to leave behind, the typical ever-present fear of just, of just random violence. They're going to leave behind a struggling Southern economy, which is still trying to become the new South, right? Because of the monoculture. So they're going to leave all these things behind, and they will participate in what becomes known as the Great Migration. Now, it booms after 1914, but the Great Migration has largely taken off in the late 1800s. Let's not put too fine a point on it. A lot of scholars will say the Great Migration starts in 1914-15. I say it started before. Let's not worry about it. The point is, at the turn of the century, by the 1900s, and then after 1914, you see this huge boom of Black people coming from the South. They will flow into the Midwestern industrial cities. You see them there: Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo. They will flow into the northeastern cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York City. Where in New York City they will settle in what is known as Harlem, which is today gentrified. It's not as Black as it used to be. But anyway, all of this, of course, as I said, starts in the late 1800s, but it skyrockets in the early 20th century. Between 1915 and the Great Depression in the 30s, about 2 million Black men and women leave the South, most of them for the North. And most of them are going to experience harsh discrimination. Mostly de facto, right? It's not always by law. That's just the way things are, right? So they experience discrimination in employment, where they do the dirty work, the manual work, the domestic work. And because they're unable to join unions very often, they don't have a lot of collective power. And very often they're used as scabs. It's kind of a gross word, but if you're from the industrial North and you know what a scab is, in the South, few people know what a scab is. But scabs are, and it's like a scab, like from a wound. That's how it's spelled, but it's not the same thing. A scab is a person who comes in to take a job while the person whose job it is actually on strike, trying to get better conditions. So this is going to cause even more conflict, because a lot of businesses will use scabs to break strikes. So a bunch of white men go on strike because they want better work hours, conditions, and so forth. Boss man will just hire a bunch of scabs, and sometimes they're white. They're not always Black, but very often they are. They will hire a bunch of scabs, and so they can pay them less, and now the people who are on strike have no more power, because if I'm the boss man, I have people doing the job, and they're doing it for cheaper because they're Black, or there's some other kind of person fresh off the boat. Scabs are also known as strike breakers, by the way. So they're used as scabs. Of course, this increases hostility, especially between Black people who are poor usually, and poor white people, like the Irish and the Italians. And with regard to housing, they're funneled into segregated neighborhoods of the North, the Black areas, and they're funneled into places that are already kind of seedy areas, places already known for crime and drugs. They kind of, nobody wants to live there as a white person, so you actually allow Black people to live there. And so in these areas, if they're already living amongst crime and drugs, that's where they're settling, their children grow up under these circumstances. And so there's a tie-in with regard to the future, right? We can't, put too fine a point on it, but there is a connection between people who grew up amidst crime and drugs and later on their own participation in crime and drugs. And so this is what happens. And so they are funneled into these Black neighborhoods, eventually called ghettos later on. And here in these areas, they suffer from, they have poor schools, still the case. They suffer from poor sanitary conditions, still often the case today. They suffer from poor police protection, still often the case today. And at the same time, they're very often paying very high rents and high food prices. They're what people call food deserts, right? Today they call them food deserts. They didn't call them that back then. But there's not always a good grocery store in the area. And if there is a grocery store in the area, they're going to charge you a lot of, they charge you high prices. And because nobody wants you to live in their neighborhood, if you want to live here in my apartment building, then you're going to pay a high price. So this is harsh for them all the way around. And we can see the results of all of this today, because a lot of this rings true today, and you can even see it in places like Cleveland, where there are certain what are called Black neighborhoods. And I lived actually like right on the border. There was a street, it was East 55th Street. You can actually Google Earth this if you like. I doubt you'll be that interested. But I lived on a place called Luther Avenue, right off of East 55th Street, which intersects Superior Avenue in Cleveland on the east side. And 55th Street was sort of this line of demarcation between what was a more sort of immigrant West Virginia neighborhood. I lived there, and on the other side, all Black, and that's where I went to school. So I kind of straddled both worlds. But you see, in fact, northern cities be much more segregated than southern cities today. It's interesting because of the pockets that were created at the time of the Great Migration and later on after World War II. And so you can still see this today. In Cleveland, you did not. Yeah, I went to school across the street, and that was it. I did not go behind the school. I had no business back there because that was the Black area. It was kind of understood. It was de facto. Nobody told me I couldn't go over there legally, but people told me not to go over there because of what might happen. And Black kids, of course, would also feel the same about coming into the other area, although the other area was becoming sort of a little bit more mixed as I became an adult in the area. But point is, you still see this in cities. The thing about being funneled into segregated neighborhoods of the North, I mean, yeah, that's bad, but it also allowed Black folk to shape their own destinies. They form their own communities in the way that we've mentioned before, right? They become sort of insular unto themselves, where they have their own little areas. They create their own neighborhoods, shaping urban Black culture. And they do form strong voting blocks in certain areas. And so, the Black population kind of in the Black community has to sort of be reckoned with, right? But they're still outsiders, and their area is still largely poorer and, of course, suffers from a variety of social ills, crime, drugs, and these kinds of things, and, of course, doesn't get as much attention from police and city officials. But they are creating a particular Black culture and identity in these areas. One second. The discrimination and segregation, in fact, promotes the creation of urban Black culture. It's not rural. It's not tied to the slave economies of the rural areas. You're going to see a vibrant culture. And one of the things that you see Black people becoming very involved in is something called vaudeville. Vaudeville was not just a Black thing. It was huge at the time. It was the major form of entertainment in cities. It involves, song and dance and comedy routines. often with people performing in blackface. Ironically, you would also see black people performing in blackface. It's strange because it's black people impersonating black people. White people who impersonated black people and black people who impersonate black people through the blackface phenomenon are exploiting white people's sort of affinity for the Bobolition thing. What I mean by that is that they're doing this to sort of appease, or they know what sells. Let me put it very bluntly. They know what sells. White people like this idea of, if you remember Bobolition, the exaggerated behaviors of black folk, right? The way they speak, the way they talk, the way they dance, the way they sit, all these things are exaggerated, usually seen as someone of low intelligence. And so, even black people are doing this, and you think, well, traitor, well, maybe not. That's the only way they can break into showbiz. This is what sells. This isn't going to change for decades. You're going to see this really still in the 60s and 70s with what becomes known as black exploitation. It's kind of like you take the word black and the word exploitation and you kind of just throw them together. Black exploitation films. I think hopefully we'll talk about this later on if we have time. But you're going to see that, this idea of, black people, in TV and movies being, leading men and women, that's relatively new. Even in the 90s, that was still changing. In the 80s, you didn't see it very much. You'd see, sort of a sidekick and all of that. But there were some movies, but not the big ones. And it was changing already by the 70s a little bit, in the 80s a little bit, in the 90s you see more change, and of course more recently a big boom, a big shift. Again, it's the only way that people can actually break into show business. You see black people who are artists, who want to engage in the popular sort of forms of entertainment, sort of buying in, and a lot of people would say selling out. But you got to be careful, sort of criticizing these people. They're doing what they can under the circumstances that they have before them. You see, Mexican people doing this, Chinese people doing this, taking roles that only like black people only sort of popularize or further, these stereotypes about these people. But, vaudeville is huge, and black people are huge in the movement as well. And black people are also creating and popularizing their new art forms of their own. In dancing, for example, they're popularizing tap dancing. In the 1920s, the Charleston, right? And so they come up with these new dances. And this, of course, is still the case today. Even when I was growing up in the 80s, all the new dances that I was into came from the black community, right? The Cabbage Patch and all these things, right? And anyway, so in music, in the late 1800s, they also create, and of course it thrives in the early 1900s, the blues. The blues, which, is kind of sorrowful and bemoaning of life, the ups and downs of life, very expressive. An example would be a woman named Ma Rainey, who's called the mother of the blues. Did I put a picture? No, I think I forgot to put a picture of her. Ma Rainey. They actually did a movie of her. Was it on Prime, Amazon Prime lately? I don't know. The point is the blues, right? That is a traditional black form of musical expression. And of course, this feeds into the jazz age of the early 1900s that mixes blues and something else called ragtime to create this sort of very rhythmic improvisational music where people just kind of sit in and they kind of just listen to each other and they jam, right? And if you're a musician, you kind of know what this means no matter what kind of instrument or what kind of music you play. But this is something that is very, very popular amongst it is part of the jazz music scene. And so they're creating these new forms of entertainment, blues, jazz. They also create something called the cakewalk, which is kind of funny and hard to understand for some people. This is actually a parody, sort of a satire of white folks' fancy balls, right? The black people have all for long recognized the pomp and circumstance of white folks' balls, where everything seems to be exaggerated, but they mean it for reals, right? It's just like everything's fancy, and you got the nicest dresses and the nicest chandelier and the nicest crystal and the best people there and so forth. And so black people turn this around and they create what's known as the cakewalk, where they have a parody of these fancy balls with exaggerated sorts of pretensions, exaggerated forms of acting, people putting on airs and walking around, and exaggerating their movements in ways that they believe are stereotypical of white folk who do this. And they call this the cakewalk. And because it's like, oh, the idea is that white people's lives, and of course it's only some white people because there's a lot of poor white people's lives are basically a cakewalk. You may have heard that, oh, that's as easy as cake, or it's a piece of cake, or that's a cakewalk. It comes from this. What's interesting is that there is from the Black perspective, a juxtaposition, sort of a putting next to, right? A difference, a contrast between the Black community that is developing and the white community as they see it, right? And so you see them thinking of the white community as a particular way because that's what they see. But they're also self-identifying in a certain way. That's not us, right? We are doing our own thing. Now, for white people, they look at this and they don't even know what the hell's going on. They're like, why are they acting like this? And it kind of has to be explained to them, if it's ever explained to them at all. But, for Black people, they have this view of white folk being this way. And it's interesting, growing up, right? And I grew up on a lot of Black friends and a lot of poor white people. And so I grew up watching television, Leave It to Beaver, and the sort of Family Ties and all that kind of stuff, right? Where you had these white middle class families who did things that I never quite understood, and I grew up thinking of white people in a certain way. And I would even tell my wife, I'm like, growing up, I thought, all white people acted this way. Maybe we were watching an old television show or something that we like to watch sometimes with our son. We watch, old TV shows like that. And I said, I thought all white folk were like this. I thought white people were a certain way because I only saw it on television or the movies. I could never understand, why, for example, if there's a noise in the closet, why, and you already know somebody's been killed, why the heck would you open up that door? Like, why would you do that? You only see that in the movies, but of course it was a movie thing. It wasn't a white thing. I'm digressing. My point here is this. The Black people are seeing white people in a certain way as well. And it has to do, again, with this sort of coming together of populations in urban settings, especially the North. They're coming up, Black folk are also coming up with resistance literature. There are people who are talking about what it means to be a Black person. For example, this poem by a guy named Dunbar, Paul Laurence Dunbar, who writes this poem called We Wear the Mask. And if you read it, you'll see that it's about Black people wearing public masks, that they feel one way, but they have to act another way. And they're always conscious of their position. And I'll tell you, I understand what that means. I'm not Black, but I understand what that means growing up where I did. I grew up, like I said, I had a lot of Black friends, but I also had a lot of white poor friends. I was never, and in fact, it's interesting because I was kind of stuck in the middle. The Black people would talk about the white people would talk about the Black people. I was like the only Mexican around, so they weren't sure where to put me, but I was sort of in between. And the point is, I still felt this way, never really knowing how, and always being, let me put it this way, always being very conscious of who I was within the community that I was actually sort of dealing with at the time. And here, if you see this poem, right, it talks about that, about how you wear a public face when in fact there's something else going on in the inside. And we can all understand that. We all wear a public face at one point or another, right? We do that every day. But for certain communities, it is chronic. It is always there. But, so looking back at all this, we have to say, yeah, there's discrimination and there's segregation, but there's also what comes out of this is the shaping of Black identity, these Black communities, new forms of cultural expression among Black people, a new shaping of the sense of being African American in these different cultural forms. There's a sense of Black cohesion, Black community. And this is something that actually is encapsulated in a song that talks about uplift, right? And which later on becomes I think it's comes out in the late 1800s, right around 1900, whatever. But it becomes known as the Black National Anthem. It's called "Lift Every Voice," and in fact, in the last year or so, you sometimes see this quote Black National Anthem being sung at public events along the Star Spangled Banner, alongside it, before it, in place of it, after it, whatever, right? And it becomes known as the Black National Anthem. It's adopted in 1919 by the NAACP, and it talks about Black uplift. Notice, lift every voice and sing. Lift every voice. You lift your voice, but then you also sing about lifting to others. That's how I understand it. I can't, I won't take that too far. I don't know, but that's how I see it. And so the song is sung in churches and schools and at Black events generally. What we're seeing here is the creation of a Black culture. And so something for them to point to. But they also have Black heroes, like this guy here. This guy is named Jack Johnson. He's a brash, sort of not loud necessarily, but not humble Black boxer. And for early 1900s, that was bad from the point of white folk. Worse yet, this guy loves white women. Worse yet, white women loved him. In fact, he married two different women. I can't remember their name, but he's got several white wives in the early 1900s, which of course is why he's hated by a lot of white folk. He becomes the first Black heavyweight champion of the world in 1908. From 1908 to like 1915, for that 7-year period or so, he's on top of the world. He defeats the white champ, and when he does this and becomes the champ and is the champ for years, it stokes racial animosity. White people start calling for what becomes known as, quote, the Great White Hope, a white man to beat this guy. Finally, they think that they can. I think they put him up against a guy named Jeffries, and they bill it as the fight of the century. This Great White Hope steps into the ring, and the ring, of course, is surrounded by racialized overtones on both sides. It's all about who's superior. Each side wishes for its race to be vindicated. For whoever wins this is going to show who's superior. Well, Jack Johnson defeats the Great White Hope, figuratively and literally. And when he does this, because all of this is surrounded by all this racialized hype, it sparks random violence against Black people across the country. One Black man is killed in a southern state, I think. Let me not say, because I'm not sure. One Black man is killed simply because he had cheered for Johnson's victory. And here there's a political cartoon that comes out after these race riots in 1910, where there's a firecracker there, or some sort of explosive, and you can see it says that couldn't have caused half so much damage, right? That the victory by Jack Johnson, in fact, creates all this damage. Jack Johnson had to go down. He actually gets sent to federal prison because under what's called this is all separate, under the Mann Act, because he actually took a young white woman across the border between states. Let's not get into that. The point is they were not going to. People at this time were not going to let this go. They cannot have this. The fact is that Black people are kind of coming together with this sort of way of thinking, and there's strength in numbers, not just in the labor unions, but strength in numbers as a Black American. People call themselves African American sometimes. That's not a new word. It wasn't, it wasn't created in the 90s. But it is about strength in numbers. They are becoming African American, but they're still not, quote, fully American. Just give me one moment. Should this entire sort of process of of movement of Black people, and they're coming together in numbers and showing pride. All of this is going to upset a lot of folks. It's going to it's going to upset a lot of white people in the North and in the South. In the North, they're concerned about competition. They're concerned about competition for housing, competition for jobs. They're concerned also about miscegenation. We defined that word before, a word that was, of course, created during the Civil War era by white supremacists who were really fearful of the creation of a mixed race. So they're worried about that. They're also worried, of course, about losing their social status. That is, white folks don't want to lose their position. Equality to them feels like a loss. Same thing going on in the South, where they view the movement of Black people as a threat. Geographically, they're leaving the farms for cities in the South, and that they're draining that labor source, which is creating greater problems for the Southern agricultural economy. Of course, they're also concerned about racial mixing, miscegenation, as I said, and they're also concerned about upward mobility of Black folk, maybe displacing them. But, a lot of Southern Blacks will see the South as their home, and they're not going to want to leave it. They wish to stay and fight. There's not one size fits all sort of person, but there is this sort of sense of overall change, and the sense of change is going to create some conflicts and backlash. Really, by 1915, white people are pushing back, and they're pushing back hard. For example, here we have the film "The Birth of a Nation" by W.D. Griffith, and it's a film excuse me, that's based on the book The Klansman, and it depicts Reconstruction as a backward, dark time for the South. It depicts Black men as immoral, as lustful of white women, as running and ruining Southern politics. Now, all the actors, of course, are white, and you're going to see actors play Black people in blackface, right? And so excuse me, all of the sort of stereotypes that you might imagine are depicted in this film. Another sort of theme throughout the film is that white people are in the South are rightfully aggrieved because the Southerners were at the mercy of a powerful Northern group of Republicans who just went in and destroyed the South. So they say, you are right for being angry about this. White people are right and righteous in supporting the lynching of bad Black men, and you are right to support the KKK. This movie is a huge hit. It's even screened at the White House for Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson has Klan sympathies. He's a huge racist, this guy, Woodrow Wilson, who, as you probably know, was president at the time. What happens in 1915 at the same time is the revival of the KKK. This KKK is going to be a bit different from the one prior. It's going to be inspired by the changes that we've talked about and the film, and it's going to thrive into the 1920s. And they're going to be people who believe in a coming race war. They're going to see themselves as the vanguard of resistance. Yeah, they're still talking about saving the South and winning the South back, but they see a bigger war coming, and they're concerned because their goal is a white nation only, what they call 100% Americans, 100% Americans. So think about what that means for a moment, right? From the point of view of these people, only certain people are quote unquote Americans. They hate and they kill people who are not like them. They can't stand Black people, anybody who's darker and anybody who worships differently, right? They look at the Jews and they call them Christ killers. They look at the Italians, they're darker and they tend to be Catholic. They look at Mexicans, they're darker, they tend to be Catholic. And I tell you, growing up, as a Mexican child, I grew up in great fear of the KKK, and I grew up in Cleveland, not even in Texas, where the KKK still exists today. And so the KKK is this sort of broad-based sort of hate group, to put it kind of not quite accurately, but you get the picture. They don't like people who are not like them. They don't like city folk. They don't like immigrants. They see the city folk as full of immigrants and full of moral degenerates, gamblers, prostitutes, alcoholics, people who believe in modernity and science. It's in the 1920s where we see the famous Scopes trial, the monkey trial about the teaching of evolution. It happens in Tennessee. And the KKK and other religious fundamentalists are at the heart of this whole thing, right? They're anti-evolution. They're anti-modern. Not all Southerners will sympathize with the KKK. A lot of them still do hold those broader views. They may not agree with the KKK tactics, but they hold the broader views of racism, religious fundamentalism, a distaste for city life, a distaste for city folk. Now, a lot of this, of course, is reflected in a lot of the attitudes today in the South. And by the way, it's not just the South, right? Many Northerners at this time, especially, but even today, they're members of the KKK or sympathize with the KKK. You will see them in Ohio today. You will see them in places like Michigan and Indiana. And so all of this is everything seems very dynamic at this time. Lots of change, lots of pushback. The war is going on, but then something happens, and that is in 1917, the United States enters the war. The U.S. entry into World War I is going to raise the stakes on the question of Black inclusion. Now, the United States enters on the side of the Allies. Again, England, France, Russia. By the way, these are the major players. And then, of course, in 1917, the United States. The central powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, right? Austria, Hungary is one country. And then, of course, other countries as well. When we enter the war, when the United States enter the war, men are drafted in huge, huge numbers. Oh, I forgot to show this picture. Talk about this picture here. What you see is a white man in blackface in the KKK film, and in this scene of the film, they're about to lynch him, and so they even perform lynchings in this movie. And I forgot to show this picture too, where the KKK in the 1920s holds these huge rallies, and when they talk about 100% Americanism, they talk about America first. So that should ring a bell to you if you look at this sign here: America first, one God, one country, one flag. Okay, sorry about that. So let me get back to World War I. Men are going to be drafted in huge numbers, right? You're going to see a lot of white men be drafted, native-born white men, immigrants, but Black men are not going to be drafted at first. They're going to volunteer in large numbers, Black men, but they're not going to be eligible for the draft because of the traditional, I suppose, concerns about Black men with guns and so forth. We talked about that with the Revolution and with the Civil War. In fact, the question of Black participation and the support of the war is hotly debated, even within the Black community. A lot of Black radicals, including a lot of Black socialists, they believe that World War I is a capitalist war. They believe that it's a war in which rich men send poor men to die for corporate profits, where rich men send poor men to die for imperialism, right? For the exercise of power over other countries. Now, there's a lot of truth to this when we look at the history of World War I and why the United States entered it. And I alluded to this before, and I really wish I could go more deeply into it, but I don't have that time. There's only so much time we have. And that is that there were a lot of bank loans that were made by U.S. banks. A lot of companies made sold food and other materials on credit to both sides, especially the Allies. So we come in on the side of the Allies. And of course, the Germans look pretty mean. So these black radicals point to these truisms about reasons for going into war, and they point to Wilson's claim that he is fighting a war for democracy. And they say, look, you're talking about fighting a war for democracy. How about some democracy here? They point to the lynchings. They point to discrimination, segregation, the disenfranchisement of people, right? The right to vote being taken away. They point to the fact that Woodrow Wilson is a racist president, and he's going to be talking about a war for democracy around the world. So people see this as hypocritical. Now, this is not the majority of black people. Most black people in the country embrace patriotism. They embrace Woodrow Wilson's talk about democracy. You will see black churches and black organizations get together and encourage the enlistment of black men in the armed forces. You're going to see them buying war bonds. War bonds it's basically a way for private citizens to invest in the war. You give money to the government gives you a piece of paper. It's like an IOU, and therefore you've just actually invested money in the war. And because it's the government, you are going to get your money back. At least you hope so. So you're going to see a lot of people embracing this idea of patriotism, democracy, and the will to fight. Du Bois, for his part, says that during World War I, black folk must set aside their longstanding grievances. Right? He says we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with other Americans, he would say, and we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with each other to defeat tyranny anywhere it exists. We need to spread democracy because that is going to benefit us. And so you're going to see a lot of black men and women volunteer for armed service, a lot of them. And and they're going to be, at first they're really going to be frustrated because the U.S. at first prohibits them from being drafted. It eventually allows it when it is clear it needs men. And of course, they're going to be sort of frustrated by the fact that black men are going to be serving in segregated units and really not being allowed to fight. So in the beginning, as I said, just to kind of repeat, because I kind of, meandered a little bit there, and that is that the draft didn't include them. So they had to volunteer. And even after they begin to be drafted, and even after they volunteer, they in fact will serve in segregated units, and they're not going to be allowed to fight at first. And these segregated units go something like this. First of all, the Marines don't accept them at all. In the Navy, they accept them only for like really manual duties, like working in the kitchen. In the Army, that's where most of them are going to end up. But even there, they're going to be engaged in training, carrying supplies, digging trenches, burying the dead, and all the while itching to fight. In fact, there's a point where the black community stands up and demands that these young men be given a chance to fight. You will see the NAACP stand up and say this. Black churches and organizations will say this. And it may sound kind of odd, but people are saying, let our boys fight. Let our sons fight. And it's because they realize that historically, fighting in a war for the United States is how, quote, outsiders prove they belong here. It's how outsiders prove they are, quote, American. And so they're calling on the military to allow them to fight. At the same time, some black men become officers. Most of them are non-commissioned, as we've seen before in the Civil War. Hundreds are commissioned officers. And all of them are going to experience tremendous discrimination in the armed forces. Black officers, they barely or rarely get a chance to command troops. Black officers, even if they're an official officer, aren't saluted by white enlisted men. That is, white soldiers just don't want to salute a black officer. And the black units, as I said, are generally segregated, or they're officially segregated. They're undersupplied. They're undertrained. In fact, when black units travel to Europe, they don't go in the same way that white units go. It's not to say that white units go in first class, but they certainly don't go in the bottoms of cargo holds of ships the way black soldiers are shipped. Black soldiers are shipped in cargo holds in the bottom of ships, and they're looked down upon as poor soldiers. And in fact, they're not even assigned. White U.S. officers don't want to deal with them. Black men are assigned to French officers. They're part of the French infantry, and they're itching to fight. When they're given the chance, the black military men do perform admirably. A major example of this is the Harlem Hellfighters. These guys are from the neighborhood of New York, Harlem, and they become known as the Hellfighters because they set a new record for 191 straight days of combat by any sort of unit like this. And in 191 days of straight combat, they do not give up an inch of ground. And so these guys are pretty tough. The unit itself earns the French Cross of War. The French Cross of War is France's highest military honor, and they're the very first U.S. soldiers ever to do so. Ironically, no black soldier gets a medal from the United States until 1991. Gets this, and it's given to a black man who was already dead at the time, so it was given posthumously in 1991. He gets the Medal of Honor, which, as I said before, is sometimes called the Congressional Medal of Honor. But no black soldier gets the Medal of Honor for U.S. service in World War I until 1991. And they perform admirably. Now, they don't always win. I mean, no group always wins. And when black soldiers perform poorly, people point fingers. In the white community, they say, oh, it's because they're black, right? What do you expect? In the black community, they point fingers at white leaders and say, you're incompetent, or you didn't train these men properly, you didn't supply them properly, or you had them out in the field too long, battle fatigue, right? So they go back and forth. But what's fascinating about the soldiers is that those who serve, they form a new vision of themselves and of race relations in Europe. In Europe, their military efforts are appreciated, especially by the French. The French treat them very well. And I found this picture here, World War I picture, and I know this is a unit from World War I. However, I don't know where it was taken. I do see what looks to appear to be a young white girl there, and she appears to be European to me. The point of it is this, that black men are far more appreciated in Europe than they are in the United States. Their culture is appreciated, the music, the dance, they're treated like men. They're treated like men by other French soldiers, and they're treated like men walking the streets of Paris or London when they're on leave. And they come to realize that they're fighting for a country that doesn't fully appreciate them or their people, but they also realize there are white people out there who are not the same as those people back home. And it's not to say that these are racial paradises in Europe, but they are certainly more progressive than in the United States. Remember, Europe had outlawed slavery long before the United States did. And so, excuse me, you're going to see these men come back with a new vision of themselves, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But the place of black people during World War I and the place of black soldiers within the military and within the idea of being American during World War I, all of that is still going to be a battleground in a sense. Tensions are going to be hot across the country. And in fact, tensions during the war are going to be heated up for things like also the flu pandemic. Remember, the flu pandemic hits in 1918 and it kills a lot of people. It creates a sense of doom and a sense of a lack of security. And at the same time, you're seeing competition for jobs growing because of the influx of black people and, of course, others from around the country, and still a few immigrants that are trickling through, but certainly all the immigrants that are there already. So everybody's fighting for jobs and housing and a place in the social order. Black people don't want to be second-class citizens, and white people don't want to lose their position. So what happens is that race riots break out across the country. I'll just give you an example. In East St. Louis, this is Missouri, a company hires a bunch of black men to break the strike by white workers. Remember, these are what you call scabs. So you have black men coming in to work when white men are on strike. They're taking their jobs. In retaliation for this, thousands of white workers randomly attacked black people in downtown East St. Louis. A week later, two white men shoot into a crowd of black people on the street. This black crowd will retaliate, and it ends up killing two white men that happen to be driving by. They're mistaken, though. These are not the people who shot. These were undercover cops thought to be the culprits. Well, when these two white men are shot, killed, the white mob rampages not just downtown, but through the black neighborhoods. They kill and torture black men and women, children too. They torch dozens of black businesses, dozens of homes. And it's going to take the state militia to end this, to stop the rampage. The state militia comes in, and it actually ends up escorting a lot of black people to safety. Many of them just end up leaving the city. After this, the aftermath of this riot is hundreds are injured, nearly as many dead, buildings and homes gone, hundreds of black people left homeless. So you're seeing the racial animosity, the tensions heating up. And to no surprise, lynchings actually spike. They nearly double in the war years from 1917 to 1919. During this time, more than a dozen, there's a bunch of lynchings, and even more than a dozen black veterans, military men, are lynched by a mob or arbitrarily killed. I'll give you an example. There was a sergeant in Alabama who was shot to death by a streetcar conductor. So the guy gets on the streetcar, and then he doesn't get his change. This is a veteran, a black veteran. He asks the streetcar, like the bus driver, for his change, and the guy just shoots him dead. This happens in Alabama. In Georgia, a veteran is killed by a mob because they demand that he take off the U.S. uniform because they notice he wore it all the time. Turns out this man had no other clothes. He had served in the U.S. military, but he was poor, and he had no other clothes to wear, and this mob wanted him to take it off. They end up killing him. And so all of this is happening during the war. It's going to actually explode into the 1920s as well. If you look at this, thousands cheered when Negro burned. Oil is poured on fire. And so this guy was accused, as you can see, of killing a girl. Now, we don't really know what happened. And these instances of frontier justice, these men are not given fair trials. And again, a lot of times it was made up stuff. Once the war is over, tensions are going to grow even hotter. From the perspective of black people, the black, they're going to expect a certain something, right? Black military men are going to return from fighting with a distinctive identity. They were treated as men in Europe, especially in France, where they served, with whom they served. They had served their country, they had stood up, and they expected to be counted. They expected greater respect, and they come home and they say, we're going to fight for it. The black community, the larger black community, is proud of the service of their sons, their fathers, their brothers, and they all seem to be hopeful for change. Black leaders, meanwhile, are running with this, and they're thinking, hey, we want greater inclusion. They're demanding greater inclusion in jobs, in housing, and a push for equality. But most white folk are not ready for that. The end of the war actually means greater competition among the races. Men come back and they're filling the jobs, and all of a sudden there aren't enough jobs, housing is scarce, and now these black men are returning from war thinking that they're somebody. In some places, some black regiments are not even allowed to march in victory parades. From the point of view of a lot of white folk, the war is over. Thank you very much. You did your piece. Go back to the bus. Sit in the back of the bus again. And so naturally, this is not something that's going to sit well with a community rising and that sees itself as part and parcel or as instrumental in the victory in World War I. So tensions will boil over in 1919. That's the year that the war actually ends. 1919 actually becomes known as Red Summer because it's a bloody summer. In 1919, lynchings spike dramatically. A lot of lynchings at this time. You will see newspaper headlines like this: Negro jerky. They're talking about jerky as, Negroes as meat, right? Dried meat. So, excuse me, you're going to see lynching spike. You're going to see race riots erupt in dozens of cities across the country. The worst is going to be in Chicago. Let me give you some background on the Chicago riot. And in Chicago, there are really, in the North just generally, there are usually no signs that say whites only, right? Most people recognize boundaries. This is sort of de facto segregation, kind of like how I grew up in Cleveland, where I knew I could cross a street, but I can't go down any of the streets that lead to that street, right? You just don't do that. That's not your area. And of course, a lot of black kids thought the same about coming to my side. And so this was de facto segregation. So there's usually no white signs, but people know where they quote unquote belong. In Chicago, certain sections of the beach on the lake, they're off limits in this way. You're supposed to know where you belong. So in the middle of this hot summer, a black teenager is on the lake and he ends up drifting. I guess he's on one of these inner tube things, right? And he ends up drifting into the white area of the beach. And it's said to be inadvertent, right? It's a mistake. Well, the white people start throwing stones at him and they end up killing him because they hit him with stones and he ends up drowning. And then white cops refuse to make any arrest, and black people are frustrated by this. And so a fight breaks out on the beach, and all of this, of course, escalates. And what happens is that whites attack the black neighborhood. And of course, this time, black people are going to fight back. And it's going to be only the National Guard that can come in and stop this. It's the National Guard that comes in. In the end, nearly 1,000 black homes are destroyed, hundreds of people are hurt, and dozens dead. By the end of Red Summer, we've seen dozens of large riots, hundreds of individual acts of racial violence, countless dollars in property damage. And the tensions are going to continue to actually simmer in the coming decades and will, of course, explode again in the 50s and 60s. But already, by the end of this war, black people are forming a new outlook. They had fought abroad, their sons did, their fathers did, or they themselves did. And they come home and they all agree, we must fight here. All of this helps lay further groundwork for the civil rights agitation that we're going to see in the coming decades. What you're going to see here is black people forming a new identity where they will stand up and declare that their lives matter. We're going to see more of this, of course, in the 50s and 60s. So for now, I will leave it there. Next time, we'll talk about the rise of this so-called new Negro, this new vision that's cementing itself in the 1920s. Thank you for listening. Be well and be good.